The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.
We have a country in disarray and a world on fire, and we need to know that we are not giving our kids options of two 80-year-olds going into a presidency.
Nikki Haley is counting on Democrats and liberals to infiltrate your Republican primary.
The reality is, who lost the House for us? Who lost the Senate? Who lost the White House? Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Donald Trump.
In 2016, I declared, I am your voice. Today, I add, I am your warrior, I am your justice, I am your retribution.
It's down to two final candidates in the race for the Republican presidential nomination, and it's only the second contest of the 2024 campaign. New Hampshire voters went to the polls today to choose between Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. Well, polls just closed in most locations, and we will soon find out who will leave the Granite State victorious. Welcome to live coverage of the New Hampshire primary from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. I'm joined tonight by video reporter J.M. Rieger and James Homan with the Washington Post Election Insights team. He'll be tracking the results as they come in tonight. We'll also go live to Manchester and senior political correspondent Rhonda Colvin. Well, here's where things stand. The latest poll from the Washington Post shows former President Donald Trump with a significant lead over his former UN ambassador, Nikki Haley. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis dropped out of the race on Sunday. He had finished second in Iowa, but saw no path to victory in New Hampshire or beyond. James, let's start with you. What is on the line in New Hampshire tonight?
Nikki Haley said that New Hampshire would check Iowa. She also said for a year that if she could get a two-way race with Donald Trump, she'd win. We'll find out on both matters whether she was right tonight.
Thank you so much, James. Our senior political correspondent, Rhonda Colvin, is in Manchester, where it's chilly but not nearly as cold as Iowa, at least, Rhonda. What is the big question of the night?
The big question here tonight is if the undeclared voters who have a very significant block in the electorate in New Hampshire, if they will influence this election right now. We know that Nikki Haley seems to perform better with independent-minded voters, and New Hampshire has a lot of them. In fact, they make up the most voters in this state. They beat Republican and Democratic voters who are registered by party. So I'm really looking at what type of results we can read into that. If Nikki Haley's messaging to them that she is the anti-Trump, that she is not about the chaos, if that works for New Hampshire voters, and we'll see. And I'll also add, I spoke with the Secretary of State yesterday. He is predicting that this will have a record turnout here. Of course, they only have one day for this primary. There wasn't any early voting, but he is saying with the energy of how many voters are on the roll that he is expecting this to be a record turnout.
Well, Washington Post reporters like Rhonda have been all over New Hampshire throughout this primary contest. With us tonight at the candidates' campaign events are reporters Jorge Ribas, who joins us from the Nikki Haley event in Concord, and Rich Matthews, who's outside the Trump event in Nashua. So, Rich, set the scene for us tonight in Nashua.
Well, as you just mentioned, former President Trump is here in Nashua at the Sheraton Hotel. I just went inside to see the room a little while ago. It's surprisingly small. Part of the reason we're out here, it's just so full in there. But we'll be going inside and checking and listening, certainly, to his speech. The campaign has promised that he will speak here tonight. Libby?
All right, thanks, Rich. Let's go to Jorge. Jorge, what is the atmosphere like at Haley's watch party tonight?
Yeah, Libby, so we're in Concord, New Hampshire, and just for a few minutes ago, it was mostly just media here, but they've started to let people in, and you can see behind me there's a crowd forming. People were in line outside, very excited, very much hoping that some of Nikki Haley's momentum carries through tonight. Now, she doesn't have to win tonight, but she definitely has to perform better than she did a week ago at the Iowa caucus. Back to you, Libby.
Thank you. Well, politics reporter J.M. Rieger is with me live in the studio. So, J.M., let's talk about what the significance is of only having two candidates at this point. It is early in the primary contest.
It's a far cry from where we were in 2016, right, where we had multiple candidates, and it was still very much had the feel of an open primary, an open sort of election process for the Republicans. This time around, we're down to the final two in many ways, and Nikki Haley and Donald Trump. And in some ways, this is really the last stand for the anti-Trump Republicans. If they can't win in New Hampshire tonight, where can they win? That is sort of an open question, and Nikki Haley's campaign has sort of pushed back on that in recent days, saying that there is a path for her even if she doesn't win tonight. But one thing to note, Libby, is that no Republican in modern presidential history has ever won the nomination if they have not won either Iowa or New Hampshire.
How do we get to this place of having only two candidates? This was the dream of many of Donald Trump's opponents, that they could be the one to take him on head to head. How do we get here?
This is what we just heard James a moment ago. This is what Nikki Haley has wanted this entire time, is a two-person race. So we will see now in a state that kind of shapes up better for her whether she can pull out, at this point, based on polling, what would be sort of an improbable victory, but not necessarily outside the realm of possibility here. We've also seen multiple candidates over the last 2 weeks here drop out. Chris Christie, Vivek Ramaswamy, Ron DeSantis, and we expect that, you know, in the case of Ramaswamy and DeSantis, a lot of those supporters have gone over to Donald Trump's camp, and Christie's supporters have primarily gone over to Haley's camp. Obviously, that's a little bit of an overgeneralization, but that's broadly where we have seen those voters, or we expect those voters to go based on what the polls have been telling us. We'll see how much that shapes up tonight.
Let's go back to James Hohmann. James, so much of what we watch is the expectations that campaigns set, and then how the expectations, frankly, change over time, James. So before we dig into the numbers behind you, just talk to us about something that JM touched on. Nikki Haley supporters have been changing the bar of success, and that strikes me as significant. Tell us why. Yeah,
the expectations game matters, and there's a long history of people being able to claim victory in New Hampshire even as they finish in second place. Bill Clinton in 1992 is a famous example, calling himself the comeback kid. But in this case, Nikki Haley's campaign a few months ago, Chris Sununu sounded like he was delusional, the governor of New Hampshire, who's been Haley's biggest hype man in the state, saying she'd win in a landslide. Then they were saying a few weeks ago that they hoped for a 3-2-1 strategy where she could finish third in Iowa, second in New Hampshire, then first in her home state of South Carolina. They've tried to sort of adjust expectations, but ultimately, if it's a two-person race, you need to start winning some races and some delegates in order to capture the nomination. So in a multi-way race, second place might cut it to set the stage for South Carolina. It's a lot harder when there's only two people left.
All right, talk to us about New Hampshire's registered voters, James.
So the important thing about New Hampshire is it's a semi-open primary. It's not that big a state. There's about 1.1 million people who live there. There's slightly more registered Republicans than Democrats, but the plurality of voters are unaffiliated. We call them independents. And the independents can choose whether to take a Republican ballot or a Democratic ballot. We'll talk about the Democratic race in a little bit, but it's not obviously nearly as competitive or interesting as the Republican race. So the Secretary of State says that he predicts 322,000 people will vote in the Republican primary. So that's obviously many people who aren't just identifying as Republicans. He predicts that 88,000 will vote in the Democratic primary. To put that in perspective, in 2016, when Donald Trump carried New Hampshire 8 years ago, 285,000 voted in the Republican primary. And in 2020, 4 years ago, 298,000 voted in the Democratic primary. The higher the turnout tonight, the better Nikki Haley will do. Lower turnout in this case is good for Donald Trump. The question is whether these unaffiliated voters show up and cast a ballot for Haley. They may not be doing it because they love Nikki Haley. They may be doing it because they want to register their concerns about Donald Trump. Trump, after all, lost New Hampshire in the general election in 2016 and 2020. But the question is, how many of these people turn out? And that will be the key number we're watching as the returns start to come in. How do the turnout numbers compare to 8 years ago?
Rhonda, let's talk about just how this process works, because Donald Trump, frankly, has been spreading this idea that Democrats can jump over and do these subterfuge votes in the Republican primary, and that is not correct. So tell us how it works if someone wants to vote today in New Hampshire.
So today, the only people who really had a choice are the undeclared voters, who make up, as James just pointed out, they make up about 40% of the electorate here. Those who wanted to change their party, say there was a Democrat who wanted to change and become a Republican, registered voter here in New Hampshire, they had to do so by early October. So any shifts in your party affiliation had to happen by then. So when we're hearing misinformation, either from the former president or others who are saying that Democrats will, quote, infiltrate this election and swing things Nikki Haley's way, that is not accurate. Those who are voting by party already had to register with a party before now. Those undeclared could walk into a polling site today and ask for either a Democrat ballot if they wanted to vote on that, or a Republican ballot if they wanted to vote on that. But that is a clear distinction for us to make for folks, because Democrats could not infiltrate the Republican primary tonight if they were not registered already as Republicans.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. JM, Trump has pivoted his messaging really to go after Haley because he now sees her, and she is the last woman standing, as she likes to put it. How has Trump gone after Haley? How has Haley pivoted her message to hit Trump a little bit in the last days?
That's exactly right. We've seen Haley attack Trump a little bit more in this final stretch here, talking at times about his mental acuity, comparing him to Joe Biden in that regard, the attacks that she's leveled against him. She's kind of reiterated her line about chaos following Trump. We've heard her kind of main surrogate in New Hampshire's Republican Governor Chris Sununu, sort of talk about how sick he is of Republicans losing over and over again. Obviously, the Republicans had significant losses in the 2018, 2020, and 2022 elections. But, whether those attacks are enough, Haley has really not made a value judgment attack against Trump the way that a Chris Christie did. Now, the argument obviously would be that Christie was in a lane that was not sustainable for him, right? There's a reason that Christie dropped out as early as he did. But depending on the results here tonight and how this race sort of shapes up, I think there's going to be some second guessing of whether Haley was a little too late in terms of how hard she was hitting Trump down the stretch and kind of letting him define her a little earlier and, see how that plays out here.
Let's go to Jorge Ribas to talk about more about Nikki Haley's strategy. Jorge, a lot's changed even just from a week ago. In Iowa, one of the big factors was Ron DeSantis dropping out. Now, I understand you were actually at Nikki Haley's event in Seabrook, New Hampshire, when that news broke. How did her supporters react?
Yeah, Haley, so it was really interesting. We were in Seabrook, New Hampshire, at this little seafood shack, one of these places that's famous for its fried clams and its lobster rolls. And I got an alert on my phone that Ron DeSantis was dropping out. I'm sure many of the members of the media did as well. And she came out with Governor Sununu right around that time, maybe a little bit later than she would have normally. Maybe they were getting the news themselves. And Governor Sununu introduced her and said it was a two-person race, finally. And so I don't know if that was a reference to what she said in Iowa, where she called it a two-person race when it wasn't, but that time it really was. She spoke a little bit. All she said really was that, boy, how this race has changed. And then went around the crowd and talked to the crowd during that. Now, I talked to some of the supporters that were there. In fact, some of them hadn't even really heard that DeSantis had dropped out when I talked to them. And what one gentleman told me, who was from Seabrook, mentioned that he didn't really think that it would make a huge difference in the race necessarily, because he didn't think DeSantis had really been there enough and was really touching the voters in the state. He also thought that it wouldn't help Trump or Haley either way. Now, I did talk to another supporter there who was kind of concerned that some of DeSantis votes would more go to Trump. So it was kind of running the gamut. People were concerned or not really bothered by the news. But everyone was definitely excited that it was giving her the momentum that now she could be in a one-on-one matchup with Donald Trump.
So, Jorge, you were at the Haley event tonight. Can you just give us a sense of what the energy has been like in the last few days heading into this final stretch, and how she's, tailored her message to Granite Staters?
Right. So, she has spent a lot of time and a lot of money in this state. She's really banking on doing well here. And New Hampshire's, in a sense, like Iowans, where they want to see their candidates. They want to have their candidates come to their towns and talk to them. And so I was here a couple weeks ago, and middle of the week during the workday, and people were coming to her events. She was having events in bars and restaurants. In the middle of the day, I talked to one couple who were actually sneaking out of work to come hear her talk. So these are small restaurants, but they were filled with people. We've noticed in the last few days, she's had events that were larger. We were at an event in Exeter High School just on Sunday night, and it was a filled auditorium. And she's really been connecting with voters on that message that we've talked about on the show quite a bit, that she is not the kind of candidate that Donald Trump, that she would be a more calm candidate, that she is trying to paint the brush of chaos, not just with Donald Trump, but with Biden as well. And that's really resonated with voters that I've talked to. Just this morning, we were in a polling place in Manchester, and I talked to a voter there who actually had voted for Donald Trump in 2020 and 2016. He mentioned to me that he was just kind of tired of the rhetoric. He was voting for Haley. He wasn't really sure what he was going to do if Haley didn't win in the primary, but that he wanted just to see a different candidate. He actually said to me that he was tired of seeing his family arguing about the election. He just kind of wanted things to get back to more like calmer arguments around the dinner table.
Well, Jorge, he might need to buckle up, because there'll be a lot of politics being talked about over the next months, and it may indeed involve Donald Trump. We will find out in the next couple of hours how New Hampshire looks. Thanks so much, Jorge. Let's bring in Rich Matthews to talk more about Donald Trump's ground campaign and what his team is doing. Give us a sense of what his focus has been in this final week, Rich.
Well, let me go back to Iowa just quickly first as well. That final week for him leading up to the caucus was really one big snow day because those temperatures were so bitter cold. Former President Trump and many of the candidates canceled a lot of their events. He only did one event leading up to that caucus. However, here he's been on the ground all weekend and all through the week, doing the kind of normal Donald Trump election rhythm, which is one event a day, one big event a day, where Nikki Haley is out kind of barnstorming. I'm not saying she hasn't had any large events, but traditionally she's doing more of the meet and greet. She's stopping at restaurants, speaking in smaller venues, whereas former President Trump is doing those big arena tour, several thousand people at a time for most of his stops. Another trademark of the former president, long speeches, where Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis, when he was still in, were doing 20 minutes and then maybe 10 minutes of Q&A. At the event I went to on Saturday in Manchester, Trump spoke for over an hour and a half, and he actually kept asking the crowd, do you want the long speech or the short one? Do you want me to keep going? And of course, his crowd of supporters would cheer him on. So over an hour and a half straight at that event. He has altered his message a little bit since coming to New Hampshire. Certainly in Iowa, he mentioned Ron DeSantis, he mentioned Nikki Haley, sometimes once, sometimes twice in a speech. Now he's mentioning Nikki Haley quite often. He's also brought, as you probably know, he's brought several of the former opponents here to New Hampshire, stumping with him, stumping for him. Tim Scott, Doug Bergstrom, and Vivek Ramaswamy are all here with the former president in New Hampshire.
Rich, let's talk more about tonight and what is in store tonight.
Well, again, I mentioned earlier, I was inside maybe an hour ago. The room is already filling up. It was completely full with press, even at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Everybody had to preset because of Secret Service, so they come in and make sure all the equipment is safe. But that room is going to be very full because it's a surprisingly small room for a Trump campaign watch party. One ballroom in the Sheraton behind me. The campaign tells me they expect him to speak a little earlier than normal. It was, one of his spokespeople told me that they do expect him to speak in that 8 o'clock hour.
All right, thanks so much, Rich. Anyone who's covered presidential races knows that New Hampshire is a small and intimate state where sometimes candidates can literally drive from corner to corner in one day. But while it's small geographically, there are big differences socioeconomically from region to region. So let's go to James Homan. James, you were there just a few days ago, crisscrossing the state, right, corner to corner. You were only there for a few days, but you were able to take in so many events. So before you tell us about the events you went to, tell us about New Hampshire voters and what they're like.
Invariably, they're described in stories as flinty,
yes.
Flinty New Englanders. But in fact, really, they would hate me saying this, but they're Bostonians. 75% of the votes tonight are going to come from 4 counties. Hillsborough, which is home to the 2 biggest cities in the state, Manchester and Nashua, Rockingham, which has the Seacoast, Stafford, which has the University of New Hampshire, and Merrimack. These are in many ways bedroom communities of Boston. There are a lot of people, especially in Portsmouth, who commute to and from Boston every day. Interestingly, though, Sullivan County here, which borders Vermont, is the only county that has voted, there's 10 counties in the state, that's voted for the winner of every Republican primary since 1952. But in a lot of states, you would just assume that this rest of the state, which is largely rural, would be more conservative, would be Trump country, but that's not necessarily the case. Check out this map from the 2020 general election. You can see that Joe Biden won the state, and he did well in these rural areas in the northern part of the state. You have Dartmouth up here, which is a big college town, and Biden tends to do well in the Seacoast area. And then Trump did really well in sort of the cities, the suburban Boston. New Hampshire has the motto, live free or die. It tends to be anti-tax. And so just because it's more rural up here, this vote really could end up breaking toward Haley. But ultimately, Nikki Haley is going to end up doing best in the suburban, more affluent, more college-educated areas here in basically the exurbs of Boston.
James, tell us about what you witnessed in New Hampshire this weekend and how it compares to prior campaign years in terms of just like the energy and the vitality, because New Hampshire is so accessible. There can be just such a campaign footprint in this final week. Yeah,
there's a real political culture where people, I personally have talked to voters and said, oh, who are you supporting? And they'll say, oh, I've only seen the candidates 2 or 3 times. I need to see them one more time before I can make my decision, kick the tires. Iowa actually is geographically a pretty large state. And so you can have to drive 4-6 hours between events. In New Hampshire, there is this sort of go to the events, ask the candidates questions. This year, the energy level is meaningfully lower. I've covered every New Hampshire primary since 2008, and there is just less intensity, less enthusiasm. Donald Trump draws big crowds, has energy. He's been spending time in the state, but even his supporters, it's not quite the same. And Nikki Haley, a lot of her supporters sort of really voting for her more against Donald Trump than for Nikki Haley. So there's not sort of the rah-rah energy at her events that you would have seen 8 years ago at some of the other candidates. So it is just a different vibe. And then, of course, the Democratic side is particularly weird because most people are supporting President Biden for re-election, even though he's not on the ballot. And there's awkwardness because Biden finished 5th place. And so there's a lot of Democrats who are sort of feel uncomfortable and awkward and aren't really engaged or involved. And then you have a bunch of people who are competing for those votes, doing the old New Hampshire way of doing things, but ultimately running against tribalism and party loyalty. So it's a very odd sort of feel this year. And a lot of the events I went to, there were more reporters than voters, and that is unusual.
Thanks so much, James. JM, we heard from Rich earlier about some of the former candidates who are now supporting Donald Trump. Poor Doug Burgum. You can see Rich there was like working on that name. North Dakota governor, was a candidate.
Yes.
Quickly endorsed Trump in the last little while. We've also seen some other endorsements from other candidates. There's this real rush to Trump right now. Can you talk to us about that and what that says about the Republican Party and what it says for Nikki Haley?
Endorsements on an individual voter level maybe don't have as much sway as maybe they did X number of years ago, if you will. Endorsements are actually hugely important in terms of signaling to us who the eventual nominee might be. And in this case, Donald Trump has more than half of the Republican Senate conference, more than half of the House Republican conference. He's picking up governors left and right. He had most of the South Carolina delegation, congressional delegation up in New Hampshire with him this week. It was especially notable that Tim Scott was there. Nikki Haley appointed Tim Scott to the Senate from his seat in the House. And, the fact that these Republicans are kind of saying, it's time to focus on the general this early is really significant and sets us up for, one of the shortest, if that is the case, we're jumping ahead a little here, but one of the shortest primary seasons in recent political history for sure. One other thing that's interesting to note, Libby, is that on these endorsements, sometimes there's a question of what is sort of in it for the Republican, right? Why are they endorsing Trump? Why are they endorsing Trump at this stage when a lot of them were very lukewarm to his candidacy only months ago? And, one kind of tidbit story for our viewers that I think kind of illustrates this whole point is if we remember back in 2016, Trump did not start to get major endorsements until after he had won a few states at that point. One of the first statewide officials to endorse him was South Carolina's Lieutenant Governor Henry McMaster, Lieutenant Governor at the time. Fast forward, Trump wins 2016. A few weeks later, appoints Nikki Haley, who had 2 years left on her term in South Carolina, appoints her UN ambassador, who becomes governor, Henry McMaster. So on top of that, the fact that these Republicans, there's a fear of them being primaried. They want the fundraising prowess that comes with Trump's operation. There sometimes are additional benefits, if you will, and there's already been some.
And Trump's even talked about that. I mean, Trump's talked about that specific example of picking Haley.
Absolutely. And there's already been some speculation that, Burgum, a Tim Scott, a Ramaswamy could end up in a second Trump administration.
Well, let's go live to Rhonda, who's in New Hampshire. Rhonda, I'd like to hear from you about the energy that you're feeling in New Hampshire and how much people there realize that a lot is pinned on this election in particular, because it has come down to just these two candidates. In the last 48 hours, as they were getting ready to vote and Ron DeSantis dropped out, New Hampshire could be a make it or break it state. Is that feeling coming across?
It is, but first I will say that the energy level is different from the times I've been here before. I was here last time when it was a Democratic primary with Joe Biden on the ballot, and there was more energy at that time. There were more yard signs. I actually took a drive around Manchester. That's where we are tonight, downtown Manchester. Took a ride around some of the suburban areas and neighborhoods, and I did not see any yard signs. And yard signs are that perennial image that are associated with elections, and you're also able to see who might have some groundswell in a location. I didn't see any. I saw one for a long shot candidate, but other than that, I didn't see any. And that was stunning to me. And you don't sort of feel the same energy or enthusiasm. It almost makes you wonder if folks here, knowing how important the state is, also kind of feel a sense of foregone conclusion because they know the strength that the former president has here. But there is still a little bit of energy, especially when it comes to the idea of going first. That's something that a lot of New Hampshire residents have told me, that they love going first. It's actually something that's bipartisan. Both Democrats and Republicans have told me they love their first in the nation primary status. They want to hold on to it. And they see this night as consequential to that question. They're unsure if the Democrats will restore the calendar that they shuffled around this time around next time in 2028. And Republicans also aren't sure either because there are so many uncertainties on their side, too. too. So there is this sense of, is this the last time we're going to be first in the nation? And there was rising questions about the fact that the demographics here do not match the rest of the country, which is why the DNC wanted South Carolina to go first, because of the diversity there. I think New Hampshire voters are very aware that the rest of the country is watching them tonight, watching how smoothly this goes as well, and watching to see if this does determine the election in such a high-stakes contest.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. And we'll talk more as the night goes on about just the role New Hampshire is playing on the Democrat side as well. For now, though, let's bring in Marianne Levine, national political reporter focused on the 2024 elections. And she joins us from the Trump campaign event in Nashua. Explain to us what Trump has been doing in the last days here, trying to lock up the nomination by winning New Hampshire.
Yeah, Trump has come to the state now several times. He's had consecutive rallies out here, and the Trump campaign is really hoping to wrap up the nomination fight tonight. They're hoping to have a pretty big win, a pretty decisive win here, so that they can move on to the general election. And so what he's been doing since Iowa is he's been flying back and forth between New York, where he has court hearings, and coming to New Hampshire in the evenings and having these rallies almost consecutively. So that's kind of been his strategy. Haley has a different strategy of smaller events, but for Trump, he's been flying in and out of the state and holding these large events.
Yeah, it's so interesting because it really is almost like a national level campaign, Marianne, not just a localized New Hampshire pitch. Do Granite Staters feel like Trump is making a pitch tailored to them, or have you heard them really care about that?
I think New Hampshire is an interesting state because unlike Iowa, it is more of a purple state, broadly speaking. But when you talk to people at his events, they're pretty satisfied with how he is campaigning. A lot of them enjoy going to the rallies and kind of see it as kind of a fun experience. And so I think that if you ask people who support Trump, I think they're very much fine with the way he is campaigning. And it's the way he's campaigned in the state previously. It's how he campaigned here in 2016. He's not someone who does these small retail events because he and his campaign don't feel like they have to. Right now, the polling data appears to confirm that premise, but we'll see tonight.
And give us a sense of how independent voters, these undeclared voters in New Hampshire, are talking to you about Republican candidates, whether they're motivated to vote for a Republican candidate, and if so, who are they backing?
Right now, in the interviews we've seen and in the polling data that we've looked at, independent voters appear to be backing Nikki Haley in New Hampshire. And we'll have to see tonight if she can turn out enough independents to make this a close race with Trump. I think that is the big question that we are looking at tonight. In recent polling, especially in a Suffolk University poll with the Boston Globe and NBC 10, we've seen Haley continue to have an edge with independents out here. Now, the challenge there is that Trump has a significant advantage out here with Republican voters. So Haley's going to have pretty historic turnout tonight among independents and independents who support her to make this race tight or to even win.
Marianne Levine, she's speaking to us over the phone, but she's at that event that you saw there, that podium where Donald Trump is expected to come out later tonight. Thanks so much, Marianne. You're watching live coverage of the New Hampshire primary with our team here at the Washington Post. Stay with us as results come in.
The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.
This is live coverage of the New Hampshire primary from the Washington Post. Well, polls are closed in most of New Hampshire, but some will remain open until 8 o'clock Eastern Time. Tonight is a test for Nikki Haley and whether she can see a win or even a strong enough performance here to continue fighting for the nomination. I'm Libby Casey, joining you from the newsroom of The Washington Post. Let's go to James Homan to talk about what we are seeing. James, do we have early results coming in yet?
We do. We're starting to get numbers. About 11% of votes have been counted. You can see Trump has opened up an early 7-point lead, but not enough votes to meaningfully read into that. But one of the cool things about New Hampshire is because there are only 10 counties, there are more than 200 cities and towns where we get detailed election returns coming in. So it's really easy to slice and dice and compare how Trump is doing to 8 years ago and what that might say. So let's look. We obviously at midnight saw Dixville notch vote. There were only 6 votes. All of them went to Nikki Haley. That's not reflective of the state. But now we have real big ballots dropping in. Concord, which is the state capital, traditionally kind of a more liberal Democratic area. You can see that 86% of ballots have already been counted. And in the state capital, Haley is ahead by 7 points. It probably is actually pretty respectable, especially considering that 8 years ago, Donald Trump got 29% and John Kasich got 23%, Jeb Bush got 13%, Rubio got 10%. So Haley kind of consolidating that traditional Republican lane. And then just 2 counties over, let's look at Hillsborough Township. This is considered a bellwether. Hillsborough is a place that Trump won 8 years ago with 42%. Tonight you can see 90% of the ballots have been counted. He's pulled ahead by about 30 points. Meaningfully not a huge number of votes, but this is revealing because it shows that he has sort of expanded his base in some of these more working class areas. And so those are good numbers for Trump. All in all, in the 8 towns where we've gotten meaningful numbers so far in the last half hour, there's been an average of a 14-point shift toward Trump compared to his previous performance. What's interesting is he got 36% 8 years ago, so 14% means that puts him right at about 50%, and you can see these just slightly above that statewide. So so far, pretty close with 11% in. We'll keep watching each return as it drops.
James, you just kind of dropped this in like the political pro you are, talking about Dixville Notch, which came in a little after midnight last night. Now, political junkies know what this community is, but it's such a unique New Hampshire story. So tell us about why we watch this first, and also, what it means that Haley did do a little baby sweep there.
Yeah, it is. It's super interesting because this is a rural area. It's a ski resort. It's in the far northern reaches of the state. They meet at midnight. They've met at midnight every primary since 1960. And for about 50 years, they always went with the winner. The area has really declined in population. There's now only a handful of people who live there, barely enough to be able to have a precinct that's worth counting. And so they all voted. They all took Republican ballots, and they all supported Nikki Haley. This is not necessarily representative. In 2020, Michael Bloomberg won the Dixville Township. It ends up getting a full day of coverage, but it also shows that Nikki Haley in New Hampshire can do well in some of the rural areas, that it's not like Iowa where she really did get blown out in the rural parts of the state and then did well in the suburbs. It's a unique political culture, but ultimately 6 votes is nothing compared to the now 37,000 that have been counted.
Thanks so much, James. Let's go back to Jorge Ribas, who is live for us in New Hampshire. Jorge, last week in Iowa, you talked about Nikki Haley being pretty careful about how she talked about Donald Trump. How has that changed in New Hampshire?
Right, and Libby, before I get to that, I just want to paint a little bit of the picture behind me. So they're showing some early results. There's a larger crowd now watching the screen of results. Earlier on, when they had Haley up by a little bit, there was a large cheer, but people are still glued to the results, watching it, even as the numbers come down just a little bit with Trump up ahead, but the crowd's filling in behind me. But back to your question regarding how she's really had to thread that needle, right, of attacking Trump, but not attacking him too much. I think it was was mentioned at the top of the show that she really couldn't go the full Chris Christie route. She couldn't attack him on values and other things like that. I mean, she has mentioned quite a bit regarding the chaos surrounding him, but she couches it in phrases like rightly or wrongly and says that chaos follows him, which she generates quite a bit of cheers from the crowd when she talks about that. She's also talked quite a bit about mental competency tests and the need for that for older politicians. Now, she references that to Joe Biden, but it's hard not to read some of the subtext there saying that, because Donald Trump is 77 years old as well. Now, it's been hard not to notice that lately her attacks on Trump have changed a little bit, and she's gone more after him, as you saw at this event on Sunday night at Exeter High School.
The majority of Americans disapprove of Trump and Biden. Trump and Biden both put us trillions of dollars in debt, and our kids are never going to forgive them for it. And right now, when we need to be talking about what we're doing going forward, what are both Joe Biden and Donald Trump talking about? The investigations that they're in, the distractions they have, the people they're mad at, their hurt feelings, and they have not shown us 1 ounce of vision for the future. Nothing.
Right, and so as you see in that clip, she attacks Biden, but she also is attacking Trump at the same time. So this is something that her supporters have picked up on. I mean, I had one person coming out of that event talking about how he thought that was true, that Trump would spend his next term attacking his opponents instead of solving policy issues. And he was looking for a candidate who would put this stuff aside and focus on issues that he was interested in. So those kinds of attacks, at least here in New Hampshire, have resonated with voters that I've talked to.
Thanks so much, Jorge. A reminder that Jorge is live at the Haley event, JM, so we'll be checking in with him as the night goes on. So, JM, Haley is criticizing Trump a little bit more, hitting him on the age. Also, there was this kind of bizarre sequence where Donald Trump was trying to criticize Nancy Pelosi, but kept saying Nikki Haley, Nikki Haley, Nikki Haley, and so she sort of responded to that. But are we going from like a pressure cooker of 1 to a pressure cooker of 2? Like, I mean, talk to us about what she could be doing, how she could have gone into this campaign criticizing the guy who has become her primary opponent.
Let's rewind about a week or so. There were 2 debates that were supposed to happen over the past week in New Hampshire. Trump has skipped all the debates in the Republican primary, but it would have been Haley and DeSantis on that stage in all likelihood. And Haley opted out of both of those debates. And one of those debates was the WMUR debate, which is for New Hampshireans. That is sort of like the local station, if you will, right? That is in everyone's living room. And at the time, it was the problem that happened with the problem Haley had going into Iowa was she had a one-on-one debate with DeSantis, and she got bogged down in that debate. Too much time spent responding to DeSantis's attacks, not enough time pivoting to Trump, focusing on Trump, forward-looking, talking about how it needs to be a 2-person race. So the campaign's mindset was, we're going to back out of these debates because we need to focus on Trump and how this is a 2-person race. We don't want to spend time debating DeSantis. But in retrospect, it sort of looks like a missed opportunity because we heard James off the top of the show talk about how there are moments that happen in the final week going into New Hampshire. Clinton talking about when he won in '92, surprise, comeback kid. We saw that with Hillary Clinton in 2008. We saw that with John McCain in 2000. They had big moments down the stretch. Folks might remember the Clinton-Obama primary debate, and Obama at one point sort of quipped to her, "You're likable enough, Hillary," right? So these are sort of moments that galvanized support. It felt like there was momentum. And what our reporters have sort of been consistently saying on the ground this week is it doesn't feel like there's that groundswell of momentum for Nikki Haley in New Hampshire. Doesn't mean that she can't win or perform well tonight, but New Hampshire, as much as it likes to sort of buck the trend and go against Iowa in some ways, a lot of that is preceded by kind of a moment, if you will. Nikki Haley really didn't have that this week.
You know, James, Nikki Haley had to make this decision that JM is talking about, whether or not to do those debates. And in one way, you get it in terms of strategy, because she wants to be battling Donald Trump, not in her mind, going down to Ron DeSantis. But it was this missed opportunity to get in the living rooms and the car radios and the newspapers of, I think JM said New Hampshireans, which I haven't really heard that one yet.
Granite Staters.
Granite Staters. She really missed that opportunity. So can you talk to us about those choices?
Yeah, I think the more interesting choice is the substance of what she was saying, not where she was saying it. And there's no necessarily right answer, but there are a lot of veteran Republican operatives in New Hampshire who told me they think she waited too long. It's a difficult needle to thread because Chris Christie was going hard at Trump, attacking him frontally, saying he was unfit. And Haley really waited until it was essentially a two-person race to start hitting Trump for palling around with dictators, as she put it this week, citing Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, Kim Jong-un. Then she started really attacking him for his age. She has a line in her stump speech now where she says, if Trump is going to lie about me, I'm going to tell the truth about him. Meanwhile, as this was happening, Trump, in what one senior Trump advisor told me was a pincer movement, was attacking Haley from the right and the left. He was attacking her from the left on TV for wanting to raise the Social Security retirement age to keep the system solvent, and he was attacking her from the right for immigration and past support for comprehensive immigration reform. Literally, the Trump team was sending mailers to conservatives saying Nikki Haley is a rhino, and they were sending mailers to people that their algorithm identified as moderates saying Nikki Haley is MAGA. And so they were coming at her from both sides. The Trump team was relentlessly attacking Haley. Haley defending herself on defense, but wasn't really affirmatively making a case against Trump. Now, the Haley team argues to me that if you don't have an opinion about Donald Trump already, then you're clearly not paying any attention, that people either like Trump or don't like Trump, that she doesn't need to prosecute the case. But I do think this is one of those things that will be debated forever about whether she should have taken a different tack or whether she should have said what she's saying now, maybe a few weeks earlier.
Such a great question, James. Well, let's go back to Rhonda. Rhonda Colvin, you talked to the Secretary of State of New Hampshire ahead of tonight's results. So what are some of the takeaways?
Yeah, one major takeaway for me was I asked him about the presence of the undeclared voters in New Hampshire because it is a sizable part of their electorate. And there have been calls to possibly remove them from this primary. I asked David Scanlon, who is the Secretary of State of New Hampshire, he is a Republican appointed to the job, not elected by the people, about the undecided or undeclared voter and their impact on this race. And he said they need to stay in. They're a part of the fabric of New Hampshire electorate. It's an important part for people to make up their mind, despite whatever party seems to have strength. I also asked him about election security. That is on his mind, as it is on the mind of so many secretaries of state. As we've seen election interference claims, we've seen the former president talk about rigged elections, we've seen threats to election workers, and he described what New Hampshire has planned for the general election: more security. They have classified briefings to find out if there are threats. That's something that most Secretary of States take part in. But there was one part that really stood out to me, and it's the fact that a lot of people don't realize New Hampshire did see a lawsuit filed here, just like in Maine and other states, where there were calls for the Secretary of State to take Trump off the ballot. So Scanlon had to make a call, and I asked him about why he made the call to keep Trump on the ballot, and here's what he had to say.
When it comes to the 14th Amendment, it's a little bit more abstract than the qualifications in Article 2, in that it says that if an individual has participated in an insurrection, they cannot hold an office. And the list of offices is actually quite large in that section. I believe that there needs to be due process as part of that discussion, and the determination should not be placed on one individual to make that decision. And so to have a system play out where a candidate is not allowed in some states to be on the ballot, but is in others, it's going to create chaos.
And we wrote a story that people can go ahead and read on the Washington Post site this morning, talking more about what Scanlon told us about that decision and other decisions, too, like defying the DNC and having a Democratic primary, even though the Democrats' National Committee voted not to have New Hampshire go first. So there's a lot that he told us about. One thing that might be interesting to all of us is that he did say that he expects results to come in at a normal pace tonight, that it won't be an extended amount of time for those results to be called. There has been a little anxiety about that because of the write-in campaign for Joe Biden. Some precincts are going to have to count those ballots by hand, and that will take time. So there was a thought that perhaps the Secretary of State's office would hold back on all announcements until those Democratic ballots were in. However, he said he thinks things will run smoothly. They have placed more volunteers in those precincts that need a little bit more time. So he did say this might be a regular primary night instead of one that tomorrow morning we would hear the announcement. But he did kind of give us the sense of what Secretary of States have to go through right now. New Hampshire has had 100 years of being the first in the nation primary, and his predecessors probably did not ever have to think that they would have a former president on the ballot who is facing indictments and who has also been a person who some have called for being taken off the ballot. So that article that we wrote does give a little bit of insight into the thinking of a Secretary of State right now in this climate.
Great. Thanks so much, Rhonda. Let's go back to Rich Matthews, who's not too far away in Nashua. You know, Rich, I know you've spent years reporting on the supporters of Donald Trump. What is it that you hear from them that makes them so passionate and committed to their candidate?
You know, I mean, it's just an interesting question. The former president, so polarizing on a national scale. But as you just mentioned, it's impossible to ignore how much his fan base really loves him. And I mean, that is not too strong of a word to say love. When we go to these other events, we interview Nikki Haley supporters. They say, hey, we're voting for her because she's not Trump. Or they may say, hey, we think she was good in the UN and she was a good governor. But the people at the Trump events are, you know, almost fanatical, and they are certainly fervent in their support of him. Let's take a look at some video from an event over the weekend in Manchester. Folks waited outside in below zero wind chills for hours just to get in. And then once they got in, they waited another 3 hours before the former president took the podium. Now, I've been to a lot of campaign speeches in my life, but I don't think I've ever seen the wave. And these folks did the wave for a good solid 10 minutes before Trump came out. Interviewed a lot of people, maybe a dozen supporters at this one event. One referred to the former president as being like Jesus, saying that he was being indicted for their sins. Another man who'd been to 67 Trump rallies said it's the greatest show on earth. And there were several election deniers there saying they stole it. You know it. I know it. We all know it. Important to note, of course, there's no real evidence of that happening. Politically, that's a good thing for Donald Trump, to have people love him so much, to have his fan base be so staunch. Libby, you know, it was so cold in Iowa, 50 degrees colder than it is tonight. Again, I want to say that again. It was as much as 50 degrees colder than it is tonight here in New Hampshire, even though it's still cold. It's in the 30s. But his supporters showed up. So whether it's Nikki Haley now or if Donald Trump does become the nominee, the Democrats in the fall, one problem they're going to have to face is how to get their supporters as passionate as Donald Trump's are. I don't have the answer to that. I don't know how you do it, but it's certainly a problem for anyone facing Donald Trump. Libby?
Thank you so much, Rich Matthews. Well, now joining us from Manchester is Dan Baltz, chief correspondent covering national politics, the presidency, and Congress. Dan, I just want to pick up where Rich left off. Are you hearing passion for Nikki Haley? Are you hearing passion for a Trump alternative?
Well, I think those are separable questions, Libby. Frankly, yes, I have seen some enthusiasm for her. I mean, she had two very good rallies on the final two nights of this primary. She had a big crowd in Exeter on Sunday night. She had a big crowd with an overflow room in Salem last night. These people were energized. But a lot of that energy is that she's not Donald Trump, and these are people who don't like Donald Trump. So, but I think we've known that that really is her, that's her calling card. It's not that the passion is simply focused on her. It's a combination. But I think over the past few days, she did build some support up. But we know that this is and always has been a race of a choice of, are you for Donald Trump or are you against Donald Trump? And that played out in Iowa very favorably to Donald Trump, and we will see in the next hour or two what that means here in New Hampshire.
Yeah, you wrote this weekend in the Washington Post, Dan, that Republicans are deciding not to turn the page from the Trump era and will rise or fall on that basis. Tell us more about that.
Well, this is a person who certainly shocked the political world in 2016, but his record as a candidate since then has not been particularly good. The Republicans lost the midterm election in 2018. He lost the presidency in 2020. The Republican red wave did not materialize in 2022, thanks in part to some of the candidates that he had specifically endorsed and supported. And he's also somebody who now is under indictment in 4 different jurisdictions with, as we've repeated many, many times, 91 felony counts. We don't know exactly when those will go to trial, but this is an unprecedented situation. The possible nominee of a major party under that many criminal indictments. He obviously has strengths, and he obviously, as Rich said, has a very passionate set of followers. But this election will be decided by more than that. And the question is, and we will get some flavor of that tonight, how many people are there who might have been part of the Republican base some time ago, who might have voted for Donald Trump in 2016 or 2020, who no longer feel they can vote for him, and what will they do in November if they don't?
Dan, what do you make of the quick endorsement from Ron DeSantis of Donald Trump? And Trump brought some South Carolinians up to New Hampshire to support him. Is that a warning to Haley of how hard he'll go at her if they take this contest on to South Carolina?
Well, if this race truly goes on to South Carolina, it will be a very mean and tough race. The Trump campaign has started to, go after Nikki Haley. They first did it to Ron DeSantis, and there's no question that it had an impact on his candidacy and drove him down at a time when he was trying to, get his sea legs as a candidate. They have started that on Nikki Haley, as James has mentioned, the pincer movement on Social Security and on immigration, and what they've shown over the weekend is a preview of South Carolina. They're going to line up every major elected official they can find to support him. They're going to call on people to unify behind him and to consolidate behind him. And she's going to have a very tough road if there is a real campaign down there. So I think that's what we're heading into. The Trump campaign has been quite confident going into today's vote. They have been even more confident about what they think will happen in South Carolina if she continues on as a candidate, as she said she plans to do.
Dan Baltz, thank you so much. Dan, can I ask you, where are you? You look like you're in some sort of air conditioner warehouse.
I am at the hotel where a good part of the Post contingent is working, and I've stepped out of our workspace so that I didn't interrupt everybody who's trying to write stories and watch results.
Okay, I just saw the boxes behind you. Hey, thank you. Tell everybody we said hello and thank them for all their hard work, and we'll check in with your writing as the night goes on. Thanks so much, Dan.
Thank you. I'll pass on the good words.
Thank you. James, let's go to you to reflect on what Dan is observing here in terms of just tone and tenor thus far, and also what could happen next. You might think, look, you run for president, you're going to get some punches. Are the punches that Trump threatens different than normal political punches? If you're Nikki Haley, if you're Ron DeSantis, if you're one of his competitors?
Yes, and it's really striking how quickly Trump can sort of turn on a dime. He announced minutes after DeSantis endorsed him that he's retiring the nickname Ron DeSanctimonious and DeSanctus. He said Vivek's not MAGA, and then the very next day he appeared on stage and said Vivek has always been MAGA. So Trump isn't necessarily someone who is really locked into a particular line of attack. He's willing to try out whatever works. Something that Dan was saying that I think is really important and super interesting is this idea of sort of what is motivating voters, and that electability is not as much of a motivator as it was in the past. In the preliminary exit polls that we're getting in, one of the questions we asked was, what was most important to you in choosing a candidate? Most people said someone who shares my values. Only 1 in 10 voters said that defeating Biden was the most important thing for them. And it's a reflection that Nikki Haley was traveling all around the state this weekend saying she could beat Biden in a landslide. Trump won't necessarily be able to. A lot of Republicans just don't care. That does not have the pull that it did a few years ago. And it's one of the reasons that Donald Trump is leading by about 10 points with 17% of the vote in.
Well, let's go from Republicans to Democrats. And Democrats have had their fair share of drama this election season, with New Hampshire as a mini epicenter of it, as 2 Democrats challenged the sitting president. And there is a name that's not on New Hampshire's ballot today. It's Joe Biden. Let's go to Rhonda Colvin live in Manchester for more. Rhonda?
That's right. Joe Biden is not on the Democratic ballot, but there was a vigorous write-in campaign. And I am with Raymond Buckley, who is the chair of the Democratic Party of New Hampshire. Thank you for taking some time for us tonight. Just briefly, if you could tell us, do you have any insight on how that write-in campaign went today?
It looks like it's an overwhelming success. The communities that we've seen, way beyond anything I think that any of the grassroots organizers expected.
Now, the Democratic National Committee did vote to hold the first primary in South Carolina. You all decided that you wanted to have the Democratic primary tonight. However, the DNC has also said that they will not see delegates from New Hampshire. What is your thought on that and your comment on that?
Well, first off, make it very clear, New Hampshire loves South Carolina, so this isn't about the 2 of us. It's really about the wrong-headed decision made by the DNC. You know, the president's going to be renominated by acclamation in Chicago. I'm hoping that they allow the people that have decided they want to be delegates to be able to attend the convention. We'll go to Chicago and hopefully they'll let us in. Of the 15 delegates that have been slated for Biden, 8 of them are young Democrats. These are all young people that are working very hard in the trenches and they deserve to go.
All right, Mr. Buckley, thank you so much. Have a good night. Back to you all.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. Well, it is 8 o'clock on the East Coast, 8 o'clock in New Hampshire, and JM, that means polls are closing in New Hampshire. Many places closed at 7, but there were some still open until 8. And so we'll be watching throughout the night to see how those poll results come in. We do have a race called, 8:01 p.m. Let's pause for a moment, and right as these polls close, we have a call to make. The Associated Press is now calling the Republican primary in New Hampshire. They are projecting that former President Donald Trump will defeat his last remaining challenger, Nikki Haley, in the Granite State. There are 22 delegates up for grabs in New Hampshire. James Homan, walk us through how Trump has become the projected winner.
Yeah, Libby, 17% of the votes have been reported, but we feel comfortable calling Trump the victor. The margin now matters quite a bit. It will be fascinating to see if he opens up a double-digit lead or a single-digit lead. Nikki Haley is exceeding expectations. She's hitting her targets and a little more in the parts of New Hampshire that are more college-educated, but she's meaningfully underperforming in the parts of the state that are below average in terms of college education. Trump is really running up the score in those places. You can see the red that's starting to emerge. Haley is actually winning some areas, some of the more affluent, well-to-do suburbs, the state capital, some areas on the seacoast, areas, frankly, where Joe Biden does well in a general election against Donald Trump. But Trump has opened up a big enough lead that we feel confident saying that he is going to be the first non-sitting president to win Iowa and New Hampshire in the same election.
Thanks so much, James. Rhonda, let's go to you to talk more about what this means to see Donald Trump win New Hampshire.
Well, this does match what we've been hearing for the last few days. I know when the Secretary of State said that there would be record turnout, he did mention it's because there is such energy behind the former president. So polling also suggested that Trump would be able to pull this through. As James mentioned, Haley is performing well in some pockets of the state, so there are perhaps some bragging rights she might be able to glean from tonight, and we'll have to see what her response is in the next few days. But overall, it isn't a huge surprise because we have seen polling in this direction. But I do want to point out something that our polling experts at the Washington Post did point out in exit polling today. They said 1 in 4 New Hampshire Republicans decided in the final week. That's really interesting. That does show you that there is this idea that independent streak does exist here. It isn't a foregone conclusion for Trump. He did apparently have to do some work, but there is room for that anti-Trump sentiment, which Haley was trying to bring out. The real question is, and I'm sure this is going to be something that happens in an autopsy somewhere, a political autopsy, is that did Haley come out against Trump enough? We've seen in the last few days she's had some really fervent campaigning. Her ads have been playing here. She's been across the state. But was it too late? So that's something that I guess we'll be looking at later on as we're able to examine more results and get a little bit more insight.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. Okay, JM, Nikki Haley so far doing well in New Hampshire, but not well enough to beat Donald Trump. Talk to us about her hopes for this state, the effort she put into this state, and what a loss here means.
Similar to how Ron DeSantis in some ways went all in on Iowa, Nikki Haley in some ways went all in on New Hampshire. And, you know, I'm going to circle back on the point that we made sort of off the top of the show here, which is this was the state for her, and no Republican in modern presidential history has ever won the nomination if they haven't won Iowa or New Hampshire. Now Nikki Haley has lost both states. Doesn't mean that she couldn't eventually become the nominee, but this path continues to narrow for her. You're correct that she's outperforming in some areas. That bodes well for her. And, you know, the conventional wisdom going into tonight was if she could keep it to single digits, she maybe has a little bit of
a single-digit loss.
A single digit loss to Trump. She would maybe have some momentum, some way to kind of turn to donors and say, you know, let's then make this a month stretch to South Carolina. Let's make South Carolina kind of the do or die, if you will, before Super Tuesday, and we can kind of swing that. But, you know, recent polling in South Carolina has Trump up nearly 30 points on Haley. And in New Hampshire, the polling was relatively consistent going into the primary here. Trump was pretty consistently up double digits. Haley gained in the final weeks, but Trump gained as well. And some of these candidates dropping out, you know, we talked about Christie helping Haley, but DeSantis, Ramaswamy dropping out, all that feeds right into Donald Trump.
Let's go to Rich Matthews, who is live outside of Donald Trump's event tonight. Rich?
Yeah, you know, Libby, we're talking about earlier about what would a big night for Donald Trump be, and the big night is knocking Nikki Haley out of the race. Will that happen? Probably not. Again, you know, she's performing well here, but this is a heavyweight fight now, and it's one person against one person, and you don't want to leave Donald Trump hanging around. You don't want him to have a lead, even a double or even a single-digit lead, because he's going to exploit that. He's going to do well. He performs well as the leader. He performs well as the front runner. You get Donald Trump down and on the ropes, and then his supporters, you know, have a little more trouble, you know, lifting him up, if you will. So Nikki Haley, you know, we all said that she needed to close this to within 9, 8, 7 points tonight. Again, I haven't seen the final numbers, obviously, but it will be interesting to see if she can be in the single digits. If she can, there are a lot of political experts that say a lot of us are giving this thing to Donald Trump too early. If she can actually have momentum, right? She's been saying, I have the momentum, but we really didn't see it. In Iowa, a lot of people expected her to be up in, you know, the 30 35% range, and really she tied Ron DeSantis essentially. It was enough to knock him out of the race, but it really wasn't enough to make any sort of dent in her, how much she was down from former President Trump. Again, a lot of people said she was going to do really well here, even win, including the governor. And if she does not do that, it's certainly a hit to her campaign. The biggest problem now is really keeping the campaign running through South Carolina, her home state. Campaigns are expensive, very expensive. That's the main reason Ron DeSantis dropped out. It wasn't just that he didn't see a path, he was out of money. So Nikki Haley now has to go to her supporters tomorrow and say, I need more money, I need more money. And that's going to be tough to do if they don't see results that they believe can help her become president of the United States. Libby?
Thanks so much. Let's go to James Hohman. James, before you dive into the numbers for us, let's talk about Nikki Haley and what she could keep doing, because she does have some money left. So she has some gas in the tank. Yeah. But Rich is right. She'll need more, and it's exponentially harder to get people to buy in if you're not winning. But there's also the question of what it will cost her politically, not just monetarily, to continue this race after New Hampshire. Can you talk about that, and then we'll go on to the numbers?
Yeah, so one of the hits on Haley from Christie and DeSantis and others has been that she wants to be Donald Trump's running mate, and so she's been careful, and that's one of the reasons she sort of pulled her punches until late. She said over the weekend that is, quote, off the table, and that she will not be vice president. Ultimately, at this point, obviously Donald Trump can turn on a dime in terms of how he talks about people. Hard to see her having a senior role in a second Trump term if he wins. But potentially, I mean, she's actually incredibly young. She's about 52 years old. She could run again in 2028. And if she goes into her home state of South Carolina, where people know her best, where she spent 8 years as governor, and she loses by 40 points, which is what an internal poll that the Trump Super PAC put out yesterday showed, then it is humiliating. And ultimately, losing your home state is a pretty surefire way to end your political career. We've seen a lot of examples of that in past presidential elections. So that's the risk. But there are reasons to stick it out. There are reasons to drag it out. Maybe that positions you better for 2028. Ultimately, she's going to face some hard choices. She's booked 7 figures in ad buys in South Carolina already. She has a big rally scheduled in North Charleston for tomorrow night. She is certainly eager to at least try. I've been struck talking to some of the donor class. I've talked to a couple different donors who said that if she keeps it close tonight or wins, but keeps it close, obviously she did not win, they might write checks, but they were waiting to see sort of what the margin was to see whether it was worth their investment. We still have 80% of the vote to come in, but if it does stick to this kind of 8-point margin, that does give a sort of a rationale. This means that even with everything going on, 47% of people who voted in this primary, again, this includes a lot of independents, but 47% of people weren't ready to coronate Donald Trump for a third time. And that certainly could offer a rationale to carry on to at least Super Tuesday, especially with all of the legal troubles that Donald Trump continues to face, which might coalesce or come to fruition in a way that could advantage Nikki Haley in a way it has certainly not over the last year.
Thank you, James. And we do have some news coming in, James. The Associated Press is projecting that Joe Biden wins the Democratic primary. Let's go to Rhonda Colvin for more on this. Rhonda, Joe Biden, a write-in candidate in the Democratic primary, beating out Dean Phillips, Marianne Williamson. Let's talk about what New Hampshire Democrats and the undeclared voters who chose to vote Democrat today saw on their ballot and how this played out.
Yeah, I actually have a sample ballot in front of me that I picked up yesterday. I don't know if you can see all of these names, but there are more than 20 people on here who are registered to be on the ballot, on the Democratic ballot in New Hampshire. and no one's named Joe Biden. So this is certainly something that is, it could be a record that he won a write-in campaign, but it was expected, as we heard just now previously from the Democratic Party chair here in New Hampshire, that he was hearing that it would be a good night for Joe Biden. But this does show something that is unique to New Hampshire. They did decide to go first, even though the DNC did not want them to go first. And the DNC, as a national committee for a national party, they are able to make that call for their own party. But of course, the Secretary of State defied them, offered up a Democratic ballot without Joe Biden on here. But I talked to a state senator who was a part of the Write-in Biden campaign. That was something that was a grassroots campaign among Democrats in this state, and it was really organized. It wasn't just something that was quickly put together. They had a staff. The founder told me that they went from about 10 members to over 300. They've had members of Congress be here to campaign for writing in Biden. They've had Cory Booker. They've had Ro Khanna. Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader in the House, was also campaigning as a part of this effort. They really didn't want any embarrassment because, as you mentioned, Marianne Williamson and Dean Phillips have been campaigning here, and had they had support, they might have been able to win New Hampshire, and that would have been very embarrassing for the incumbent president. So there was this real grassroots effort that I guess has been successful. I think the open question right now, from what I heard from Democrats today, is that will 2028 be any different? Will they still have to push their way forward and have a primary anyway for Democrats here, or let it go to South Carolina or Georgia or one of the other states that the DNC prefers to go first?
Let's go back to James Homan for more on what we're seeing on the Democratic side of things. James?
Yeah, it's a very respectable showing for Joe Biden. Most of these write-ins, the vast majority, are going to end up being for him pretty clearly. Dean Phillips getting 20%, which is on the low end of what he was sort of hoping to be in the mid-20s. Joe Biden, if he gets into the 70s without having his name appear on the ballot, that is a respectable showing for a president who finished 5th in the Democratic primary 4 years ago, and also who pushed the Democratic National Committee to drop New Hampshire as the first in the nation state. So no delegates on the line, but if these numbers sort of hold with 28% of the vote counted, you see, Biden, there's nowhere in the state where Dean Phillips is ahead, and it's a respectable good night for the sitting president, not the kind of wake-up call that some of the Democratic Party had hoped there might be for the president.
James, decode what we're seeing here a little bit for us, because we can see, of course, that some ballots have been counted as Joe Biden write-in, and then we have that big batch of them that has not yet been put in the Joe Biden camp. So explain the process here.
Yeah, so Rhonda showed us that sample ballot a second ago. There's like 25 names, and then the very last line, you have to circle in a little, fill in a little circle, and then there's a blank space. So when they're running the ballots through, it's easy to quickly identify that there is a write-in, and then someone looks and decides what was the voter's intent. There's a lot of different names they could write down: Joe, Biden. If it seems clear to the person counting that it was Biden, then they will put these write-ins into the Biden category. There was an effort underway among anti-war activists to encourage people to write ceasefire in as a write-in. There were various kind of yard signs around that said write-in ceasefire. So not all 73% of the write-in vote is going to be for Biden, but you'll continue to see the Biden number tick up. And based on our analysis of the numbers that have come in where they have calculated the write-in, it's very clear that Biden is going to win the state. Again, 0 delegates in play, but the re-election campaign for the president will be able to breathe a sigh of relief and prepare for what they increasingly expect will be a rematch of 2020. And we actually learned just before we went on the air tonight that Jen O'Malley Dillon, who is a senior advisor in the White House, is going to move to Wilmington, Delaware to take over the president's re-election campaign. And it really is an indicator of how the general election really is getting underway, that Biden is finally ramping up.
JM, let's talk about just how the officials in New Hampshire are looking at these write-ins and deciding, yeah, that's a vote for President Joe Biden?
Yeah, I'm going to refer to my notes here, Libby, so I get these names correct. These are some of the variations that people could write in that would be counted for Joe Biden tonight. So Joseph Biden is one, President Biden. Voters could misspell Biden's last name, B-I-D-O-N, and it would still count. J. Biden, Joey B., Joe and Kamala. All of those variations counted in the write-in for Joe Biden. One interesting thing that James just brought up was talking about anti-war sentiment, the ceasefire initiative. One of the last times that we saw a write-in successful in New Hampshire in a Democratic primary was LBJ in 1968, and he was put in as a write-in because of opposition to the Vietnam War. So it's interesting some of the historical parallels there that pop up. And one last thing, Libby, and James mentioned this, which is, you know, Biden.
I'm going to have to cut you off right there, JM, because Nikki Haley is coming on stage to address her supporters. Let's go live to her speech in New Hampshire.
What a great night. God is so good all the time. Thank you, New Hampshire, for the love, the kindness, the support, and a great night here tonight. Thank you so much. I want to first say thank you to my husband, who I know is watching right now. I love you. We're excited to have you. Thank you. I want to thank my kids who are here, Rena and Naylan and Josh, who have really kind of stepped up and just given me the support I need. You know, you really pull on your family when something like this happens, and I am incredibly blessed by their support. I have my parents at home, and I will always say that the way they raised me, to know that we lived in the best country in the world, but to also know that the best way you appreciate your blessings is to give back. Thank you, Mom and Dad. I love you so much. To my siblings, to my in-laws, to everybody back at home, to Vicki for helping me take care of Mom and Dad. Thank you for that. You know, I will tell you, it feels like it's been a lifetime, but it has been almost a year that we've been campaigning in New Hampshire, touching every hand, answering every question, being the last person to leave. And we had the most amazing thing happen is the second that we got the endorsement from Governor Chris Sununu. I mean, a true governor that doesn't stand behind a podium. He shows up at a diner. He shows up at the brewery. He loves the people of New Hampshire. He has been with me every single day at every single event. Chris, I couldn't have done it without you. And I want to thank someone who was with me on day one. He's a patriot. He's a hardcore conservative. And he is my friend, General Don Bolduc. And Sharon, thank you so, so much. I want to congratulate Donald Trump on his victory tonight. He earned it, and I want to acknowledge that. Now, you've all heard the chatter among the political class. They're falling all over themselves, saying this race is over. Well, I have news for all of them. New Hampshire is first in the nation. It is not the last in the nation. This race is far from over. There are dozens of states left to go. And the next one is my sweet state of South Carolina. At one point in this campaign, there were 14 of us running, and we were at 2% in the polls. Well, I'm a fighter. And I'm scrappy. And now we're the last one standing next to Donald Trump. And today we got close to half of the vote. We still have a ways to go, but we keep moving up. For a lot of people, politics is way too personal. It's not personal for me. I voted for Trump twice. I was proud to serve America in his cabinet. I agree with many of his policies. I decided to run because I'm worried about the future of our country and because it's time to put the negativity and chaos behind us. We have an economy that's crushing middle-class Americans. We have a border that is totally open and dangerous, creating a disaster in our country. Unbelievable! We have schools that are failing too many of our children, and we have a world on fire with a war in Europe and the Middle East and a huge and growing threat from China. And then you look at Washington, D.C. We have a Congress that fights about everything and accomplishes nothing. And we have Joe Biden in the White House making one bad decision after another, when he's making any decisions at all. Our country's in a real mess. And the question is, who's going to fix it? With Donald Trump, Republicans have lost almost every competitive election. We lost the Senate. We lost the House. We lost the White House. We lost in 2018. We lost in 2020. And we lost in 2022. The worst kept secret in politics is how badly the Democrats want to run against Donald Trump. They know Trump is the only Republican in the country who Joe Biden can defeat. You can't fix the mess if you don't win an election. A Trump nomination is a Biden win and a Kamala Harris presidency. I defeat Biden handily. We want you, Nikki! With Donald Trump, you have one bout of chaos after another. This court case, that controversy, this tweet, that senior moment. You can't fix Joe Biden's chaos with Republican chaos. The other day, Donald Trump accused me of not providing security at the Capitol on January 6th. Now, I've long called for mental competency tests for politicians over the age of 75. Trump claims he'd do better than me in one of those tests. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't. But if he thinks that, then he should have no problem standing on a debate stage with me. Most Americans do not want a rematch between Biden and Trump. The first party to retire its 80-year-old candidate is going to be the party that wins this election. And I think it should be the Republicans that win this election. So our fight is not over, because we have a country to save. In the next 2 months, millions of voters in over 20 states will have their say. We should honor them and allow them to vote. And guess what? In the next 2 months, Joe Biden isn't going to get any younger or any better. We'll have all the time we need to defeat Joe Biden. When we get to South Carolina, Donald Trump's going to have a harder time falsely attacking me. The great people of South Carolina know I cut their taxes. They know I signed the toughest illegal immigration bill in the country. They know we passed voter ID and tort reform and ethics reform, and they know we moved 35,000 people from welfare to work. Every time I've run for office in South Carolina, I've beaten the political establishment. They're lined up against me again. That's no surprise. But South Carolina voters don't want a coronation. They want an election. And we're going to give them one. Because we are just getting started. Thank you for the energy. Thank you for the love, New Hampshire. We're going home to South Carolina. I love you too. Thank you. Thank you. Now, I want to say it's really important that I say some additional thank yous. I thanked Governor Chris Sununu and General Don and Sharon Bolduc, but I also want to mention just a few other people who've been incredibly gracious to us. To the entire Sununu family, including Governor John Sununu and Senator John E. Sununu, thank you, thank you, thank you. Senator Judd Gregg, thank you for your advice, thank you for your encouragement, and thank you for your support. I'm truly grateful. Kim Rice, thank you for being with me since the very beginning. I love you.
Nikki Haley vowing to stay in the race. She's there on the stage there with her family. A reminder that Nikki Haley's husband is actually serving overseas, and she gave a shout out to him tonight. Haley not coming in first place in New Hampshire, a state that she talked about investing basically like the past year in. She's been there, a presence since she launched her campaign almost a year ago, and this has been a very important state for her. But she is vowing to fight on. She had some hard hits against Donald Trump, and she plans to stay in this race. Let's go to Jorge Ribas for more, who is live at Nikki Haley's event in Concord. Jorge, let's go to you.
Yeah, Libby, so she's still speaking behind me. She's still thanking all the people who helped her campaign here in New Hampshire. And you heard at the beginning of that speech where she congratulated Donald Trump, kind of really setting her apart in sort of her graciousness that she's talked about a lot in the campaign, unchaotic candidate and things like that. And then, I mean, you can hear behind me, it's really raucous, and there's a lot of people, and they're cheering. They've been cheering her speech the whole time. I can barely hear you when you're talking to me, and they're cranking the Tom Petty right now. But so she gave a speech, and largely what she talked about is essential elements that were in her stump speech throughout the campaign, talking about Donald Trump as a chaotic president, really leaning into the fact that certain polls have shown her beating Joe Biden head-to-head, whereas Donald Trump would be closely matched. One of the biggest applauses she got, really one of the biggest cheers, was when she talked about when Trump misspoke just a few days ago, saying that she didn't supply security for the Capitol on January 6th, and he said her name several times. And she talked about, in referencing that, how, you know, that she's advocated for mental competency tests, and then mentioned how Donald Trump would say that he would beat her. And one of the things she took from that was that saying that, well, if he was so confident that he would beat me, he should debate me. And that's been an ongoing theme throughout this campaign, is that he hasn't joined her and the other candidates on the debate stage. So this was like a direct confrontation, telling him, like, come debate me when she goes to South Carolina. And she's moving to South Carolina next week. There's a lot of challenges leading up to that. But what I take from tonight in this crowd behind me is that they're still riled up. There's a lot of excitement. Now, granted, she's talking to people here who are huge supporters of her, and the things that she's saying here have really resonated with the people here and the people that have been at her events. Obviously, they didn't resonate with enough Republican voters throughout the state, but she's done better, I think, than most people expected, or at least some of the people that expected her to come further back. And that's one of the things that I talked to voters throughout this campaign here in New Hampshire, is that they wanted to see her do well. I mean, they wanted her to win, obviously, but they just wanted to see her perform better than she did in Iowa, better than expected. And it looks like tonight so far that she has done that.
Thanks so much, Jorge. Live at the Nikki Haley event in Concord, New Hampshire. This is live coverage of the New Hampshire primary with the Washington Post. Early race calls from the Associated Press for both Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump tonight. Stay with us.
The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.
You're watching live coverage of the New Hampshire primary with the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. Let's catch up. The Associated Press has called the Republican primary for former President Donald Trump. In the Democratic primary, a write-in campaign for Joe Biden has been successful. The Associated Press calling that race for the sitting president. Now, there are no delegates at stake in the Democratic primary tonight. Let's go to my colleague, J.M. Rieger, here in the studio with me. What do these two back-to-back wins in Iowa and New Hampshire mean for Donald Trump?
It gives them momentum. It gives them momentum going forward. This was supposed to be Haley's best state. Now, Haley has done better than, she mentioned it in her speech there, she's done better than the pundits, including myself, have thought that she would potentially do, and she's outperformed at this point. There's still a lot of vote to come in, as James will talk about, but, you know, at this point, she's done better than what the polling had. But, you know, I think this touches on a very important point here, Libby, which is Republican voters want Donald Trump. They are saying that over and over again in polls, in exit polls. James talked earlier about electability and how it's not a priority for Republican voters. It's not in these primary voters not showing up in the exit polls, didn't show up in the entrance polls in Iowa last week. And in part, that's because they're saying, you know, immigration, economy are their top two issues. But on top of that, we're seeing a significant chunk of primary voters questioning the results of the 2020 election. So one reason that electability is not top of mind for Republican voters is because they think that Trump won in 2020. So if you think that the person won in 2020, why would you not think that he could win again? And then on top of that, Trump has really remade the party in his vision, right? In his defined conservatism, if you will.
Are you surprised that Haley is swinging punches a little cleaner at him tonight?
Yes, I think this is one of the strongest speeches we've seen her give, and
one of the most directly confrontational against her main opponent. Let's be clear, this is the man she wants to defeat.
Yes, and Jorge hit it right on the nose. The debate line, the direct challenge to debate, for Trump to come and debate her.
And tying that to the mental acuity and
yes.
the age question.
Yes, and we are seeing, we talked about, one of the things we talked about at the top of the show is we saw her hone her attacks a little more on Trump in these last few days. We're now seeing her kind of continue that going forward. And we said that she needed to keep this to single digits to have viability moving forward. Still early, but that's kind of where we're at right now. This suggests that she might have some momentum going into South Carolina, might be able to make that a little more of a race than polling has it at right now. Now, that doesn't get us to Super Tuesday and what that looks like, but in terms of the immediacy here, Haley's kind of done what she set out to do, which is make this a one-month sprint to South Carolina.
Let's go to James Hohmann for more on that single-digit lead by Donald Trump at this point. James, break the numbers down for us and tell us more about what you know.
Yeah, we've been looking at the exits, and it does seem that there's an almost even split, half and half, in the Republican primary between independents, the unaffiliated voters, and registered Republicans. Now, the story of the night we knew going in would be just how that balance shook out. And as expected, Nikki Haley won the independents by 2-1, but Donald Trump won the Republicans by 3-1. That is the story of tonight. The exit polls also show that a quarter of voters identified as very conservative. Trump won 9 in 10 of them. 6 in 10 said they're somewhat conservative. That's 40% of the electorate are liberals. Trump won 6 in 10 voters who described themselves as somewhat conservative. Haley won those who described themselves as moderate by a 4-1 margin. This is a much more sort of traditional Republican electorate, much more moderate than Iowa. There are a couple really interesting indicators of this. Remember last week in Iowa, we talked all about the abortion numbers and how 61% of the Iowa caucus goers supported a total and complete national ban on abortion. It is inversed here. Among the 2/3 of New Hampshire Republican primary voters who oppose a federal abortion ban, Haley was their favored candidate. She got over half of those voters. Trump dominated among the 3 in 10 who favor a federal abortion ban. Remember, he appointed the justices who overturned Roe v. Wade. He got 3/4 of those voters. JM was just making a really smart point about how if a lot of voters think that Trump won legitimately in 2020, they see him as electable. But there are far fewer of those voters in New Hampshire than there were in Iowa. Just under half of Republican primary voters in the preliminary exits believe the false claim that Biden didn't win the 2020 election. They went to Trump by a 6-1 margin. The other half of the electorate that said Biden did win, they went to Haley by a 4-1 margin. So that captures the dividing lines inside the GOP today. The party is still clearly pretty split. It is, as Haley said, which may have been stretching things a little bit, she got close to half the vote. South Carolina primary is technically open in the sense that there's not party registration there. It's a much redder state, a lot more conservative, but it is an open primary like New Hampshire.
Let's go to Rhonda Colvin for more reaction to Nikki Haley's speech tonight. Rhonda?
Yeah, one of the things that stood out to me, and I believe Jorge also mentioned it, is that line where she said, "I beat Biden handedly." That is correct, according to polling. I looked at some polling earlier today. In the last 3 polls taken on the question of the general election, the remaining candidates, when DeSantis was in as of last week, out of all those remaining candidates, she was the only one who was either neck and neck or a few points ahead of Biden in a general election matchup. So that is an important question here tonight is, are her strategists and the Republican Party who want an anti-Trump candidate going to think about that message and kind of turn that in to the Republican voters while she's on the campaign trail for the next month? Because she got here tonight by that message of, we don't want any more chaos. I'm not the candidate who's bringing a bunch of baggage. That may have gotten her to New Hampshire, but perhaps what can get her to stay for the next few weeks is, I'm the one who can beat Biden in the general election. Because I think, of course, we all focus on these primary nights, but we still have a ways to go when it comes to the actual presidential election next year, so or this year, but in the fall. So I think that's something that she's probably going to have to grapple with. Does she change her messaging a little bit and try to tell voters, look, if we want to go ahead and think ahead and be the winning party, perhaps we elect me. But they also have to consider the question, too. Her camp has to consider the question, do they want a third go-around? Because for her to go to her home state and not win it, that essentially would give Trump even more momentum, even more power, even more hold on the Republican Party, because he will have 3 examples of having won. And of course, it's her home state. The optics of that, losing that could be crushing. She is young. She does potentially have a very long future ahead of her in politics. So does she want to risk being embarrassed in her home state? 7 out of the 8 members of the South Carolina delegation in Congress have endorsed Trump. So that is kind of telling about the Republican Party, especially those who are elected officials in the Republican Party feel about her from her home state. That may not be what the constituents or the electorate in South Carolina feel. We'll have to see that in the next few weeks. But it is an interesting question right now. Are they going to figure out, does she want a third go-around of this?
I want to bring in national political reporter Isaac Arnsdorf now, who's joining us from Manchester. Isaac, as we see these initial numbers come out tonight, these results, what does it tell you about the campaigns of Trump and Haley?
Well, I still want to see what the margin ends up being, if that's smaller or larger than the polls were showing, and the decisiveness of that victory. I mean, it is impressive that she got the unaffiliated turnout up to half of the electorate and did really, really well with those voters. I mean, it's a lot to ask a non-Republican to vote in a Republican primary. And so that does show a weakness for Trump, because guess what? If he's going to win the general, he can't just win Republicans. He's got to win some independents, too, and especially those right-leaning independents. And when I was out at the polls today, I talked to a lot of Haley voters who said, Trump's the nominee, I'm not voting for him again. That's a problem for him.
We're looking at some footage, Isaac, of earlier today as people were voting in New Hampshire. Where do those voters go now? Like, if you follow the thread of thought that you were on, where do all these voters go if that's how they feel?
Well, some of them will come home for Trump. Some of them will hold their nose and pull the Republican lever because they're used to voting Republican. Some of them will stay home, and some of them will hold their nose and vote for Biden, even if they're not happy about it. But close elections are won and lost on the margins like that.
So, Isaac, what were you chasing in the final days of the campaign, and what stands out to you in terms of messages that really resonated with voters, or energy and attitudes?
Well, you were talking before I got on here about the electability argument, which Haley has really been staking her case on. And we saw in the exit polls that was the least popular choice for what what the voters in the Republican primary said they were prioritizing. They cared about a candidate who fights for them, or the candidate who represent their values. The least popular option was a candidate who can beat Joe Biden. So, that's, to the extent that that's her case, that is just not what Republican primary voters are prioritizing.
And let's talk about some of the punches that Haley was throwing at Trump tonight quite directly, and some that were landing a little more gently earlier in this week. Are voters responding to concerns she's raising about his age, his mental acuity, and the quote-unquote chaos that, she sometimes has it in this passive voice, like chaos follows him? as though it's like a weather system. Tonight, she seemed to be a little more directly talking about his role in all of this. How do voters respond?
Well, I heard that her supporters in the room were cheering for it and shouting back about it. But we've seen, part of the reason she's leaned on those kinds of attacks and the electability attack is because when the other Republican campaigns have gone out looking with focus groups and polling, what messages can we use to attack Trump, they've basically come up empty with messages that are effective with Republicans and don't backfire.
Okay, so what's next for you, Isaac, and what's next for this campaign?
Well, we've got to see, again, when the smoke clears, when we get the actual final margin, what that looks like and whether Haley really is going to take the fight to South Carolina. All we know is that she's not dropping out tonight, and that pressure is going to continue to mount. More Republicans who are going to come off the sideline and support Trump or endorse Trump. We saw John Cornyn, who is not a Trump fan, coming out with an endorsement tonight. And the Trump campaign is making it very clear that if Haley wants a fight in South Carolina, they're going to give it to her. It's going to be nasty, and they are going to keep cranking up that temperature to try to wrap this up.
Thanks so much. Isaac Arnsdorf on the campaign trail in Manchester. James, let's head back to you because we're getting some new numbers in. Give us some insight into where Haley is actually losing some voters. What are you seeing?
Yeah, there's a bellwether that I think is incredibly important. Both candidates held events there over the weekend. Trump had a big rally on Sunday. We now have 28% of the vote in statewide, and you can see here, Rochester. This is kind of the bellwether. It is a working class community. There's a big opera house there where Trump was at capacity. He won by 20 points in 2016. Tonight, he's winning by nearly 30 points. And that is the story of the new coalition. The Republican Party has changed. Turnout is high. This is working class. Nikki Haley is not fully consolidating sort of all the non-Trump coalition from 2016. It seems in areas, for example, where Jeb Bush was strong 8 years ago, she's not hitting the numbers that she quite needs to hit. Now, this is an area I expected would go to Trump, but I think the margin was what was interesting. And if Trump is winning Rochester by this margin, there's no way Nikki Haley is going to win statewide. You see, though, there are areas around the state where she is winning, but the big question now is the margin. I think if this ends up being a single-digit outcome, then it really does give Haley a good rationale to go into South Carolina. If Trump ends up pulling ahead with 70% of the votes still left to count and getting into 12, 13 points, it really does push a lot of Republicans like John Cornyn, as Isaac just mentioned, the Republican from Texas, to get on board the Trump train. So still watching closely. There's a few more bellwethers we're waiting for some numbers to come in from.
James, I want you to drill down a little more on why 9 might be okay, but 11 might not be okay. Yeah. I mean, is it about the reaction that other Republicans have or other pundits have? I mean, why are you looking so closely at the single digits versus a larger win for Trump? The
double digit thing matters with donors quite a lot. You saw Ken Langone, who is the co-founder of Home Depot, a major Republican donor. He told the Financial Times a couple days ago that he's going to write, I guess it would be an 8-figure check if Haley comes close enough in New Hampshire. I think for that kind of the donor community, that number matters quite a lot. There is this perception that New Hampshire could be Haley's high water mark. If you're a major Republican donor and you think Trump's going to eventually become the nominee and maybe you want to get an ambassadorship, you want to get on board with the Trump team. So Haley has to convince those Trump critics in the donor class in this weird environment now where compared to 8 years ago, I was really struck there at the end of Haley's speech where Haley was saying, I've run against the establishment before and now they're lining up against me again, which is true. In 2010, she was very much a Tea Party candidate. Her big endorser in that governor's race primary in South Carolina in 2010 was Sarah Palin. She took on kind of the powers that be in Columbia. And now I don't think any of us 8 years ago would have imagined that Donald Trump would be the Republican establishment, but he is. And it is very much, the party has changed to be a lot more in his image than it was the last time there was a competitive primary in New Hampshire.
Well, now that Donald Trump and Nikki Haley are the only Republicans left standing, their attacks on each other have been ratcheting up. Let's go to Rich Matthews, who's been on the Trump campaign trail this week. Rich, tell us more about how Trump's message changed since Iowa. We've been talking a lot just now about how Haley's refining her message. How has Trump changed his message?
Well, he certainly talks more about Nikki Haley than he did in Iowa. In Iowa, his primary target was Joe Biden. He still talks about Joe Biden quite a bit in his speeches, but he's added several lines about Nikki Haley. And all I'm curious about, right, is what he's going to say when he takes the stage behind us in just a few minutes. Because, you know, if we think that the attacks on each other have ratcheted up already, well, now that it is just two of them, and now that she said she's staying in the race, you can only expect the former president to turn up the volume even more. One thing that I want to share at a rally this Saturday here in Manchester, New Hampshire, former President Trump responded to one of Nikki Haley's attacks that she's been making that questions his competency to serve as president. Let's take a listen.
Because cognitively, you know, I don't know if you saw, but a few months ago, I took a cognitive test. My doctor gave me. I said, give me a cognitive test just so we can, you know, because you know what the standards were. And I aced it. I also took one when I was in, but I also took one when I was in the White House. No, I'll let you know when I go bad. I really think I'll be able to tell you, because someday we go bad. But, you know, I've had, and they always say, like Haley, she talks about, yeah, we don't need 80-year-old. Well, I don't mind being 80, but I'm 77. That's a big difference.
Now, just a couple of days ago, Trump actually challenged Nikki Haley to take a cognitive test against him. I don't know that they even have such a thing, but he said she would not win. Obviously, in this speech that we just heard a few minutes ago, she went ahead and turned that back on Trump by saying, if you're so smart, if you can ace these cognitive tests, why don't you just stand on a stage and debate me? I mean, it's certainly a valid question, especially if she does poll within single digits here in New Hampshire. It will be very interesting to, again, see what President Trump, former President Trump, says in the next few minutes when he takes the stage, but also if he responds to that direct challenge from Nikki Haley. Libby?
All right, we'll be listening. Thank you so much, Rich Matthews. Rhonda, let's go to you to talk about this important role of these undeclared voters, the independents of New Hampshire, and why you've been watching them so closely, and what Nikki Haley's success with them may say about her ability to win over Republican voters in future states.
Yeah, the undeclared voters in New Hampshire make up about 40% of the rolls here. They're a sizable block, and that's not just in this election. That goes way back. In fact, I went through the records on the Secretary of State's site, and you have to go back to the 90s to see any election where Republicans and Democrats outnumber the number of undeclared or unaffiliated voters. So that is really a strong part of the political thinking here, that they are independent-minded. And we also know from our exit polling that people made the decision on who they would vote for today within the last week. So there is a lot of room for that independent thinking. This is also a national trend, too, something I reported last year when we covered the midterm elections, that because the partisan divisive politics are pretty much making a lot of Americans fatigued, a lot of folks who can register in their state as unaffiliated voters, where they do not sign up to vote as a Republican or Democrat, those rolls are rising. polarizing in very important states like Nevada, like South Carolina, and of course, New Hampshire. So this is a trend that you're seeing nationwide, and it is kind of a side effect of the partisan politics. And we'll have to see, in the next contest, as well as in the general, if they really play a role. The louder these candidates get, the more divisive they are, you might see more rolls sway the undeclared way.
So much. Rhonda, I want to go to JM next to talk with you, JM, about this question of the path forward here. So just lay out for us the states, basically, because people may be listening and saying, wait, what do you mean South Carolina? What about Nevada? What about, there's, this primary calendar is peppered with important states along the way. So explain the process.
Yes. So Haley did skip over. Nevada is next. Yeah. So she's not on the Nevada caucus because what happened was Nevada put in a law, said we're going to have primaries going forward. The RNC said, no, we're going to go caucus route. So Trump's the only name there. So we've heard Trump in recent days talk about how I've got 100% of Nevada. Obviously, nothing's official yet at this point. But yes, Trump is the only major candidate who's going to be on the ballot in Nevada. So there is going to be a news cycle there. Haley wants to make this kind of a month-long sprint to South Carolina, her home state. There is going to be a news cycle there where Trump wins the delegates in Nevada in all likelihood. And then you go to South Carolina. We got a few states sprinkled in, and then we go to Super Tuesday. The problem Haley's going to face here is all of these states coming up here, with a couple exceptions, really shape up better for Trump. The types of voters that Trump is winning so far in Iowa and New Hampshire, those voters are a much bigger representation, if you will, of the states coming up on the map, including in South Carolina. So there is, we heard James just a moment ago talking about donors and the margin here, and that's exactly correct. So there is money potentially on the table here if Haley needs it to keep this campaign going. But the question is going to be the margin, and then even if she can keep the margin to single digits, the question is going to be, where does she start to make inroads? Where do we start to see her pick off some of that Trump support that so far she really hasn't been able to do? And, we'll see if that happens here. A month is a long time. A lot can happen in a month in politics. One last thing I'll quickly note on Super Tuesday, that on top of the electorate shaping up well for Trump, the rules in those states that the Republican Party has put in place shapes up well for Trump. So let's just take California, for example. We're jumping ahead a little here, but Super Tuesday, which would also, by the way, be the day after Trump's first appearance in D.C. court for the January 6th trial, if that holds. California's got 169 delegates on the ballot. If Trump wins, hypothetically, if a candidate wins 50% or more, winner take all. There's a lot of states that have put that in place that shapes up better for Trump, especially if it's a head-to-head race. Right now, the margin, he's over 50%. A lot of these states would shape up better for Trump here.
So even if it was a tight contest in a state like California,
it doesn't do.
Second place doesn't get you somewhere.
Second place does not get you somewhere. This is where you got to start making moves.
Math,
Yes.
Let's go back, JM, to Concord, New Hampshire, and our colleague Jorge, who's been talking to Haley supporters. Jorge, take it away.
Libby, it's mostly cleared out here at the Haley event after she spoke to supporters. There was a huge crowd here. They were very raucous. I'm joined here with Mike Hess, who was here. And Mike, your wife was actually on stage, right, during that?
Yeah, she was up there over to the right. And Nikki said, shook her hand as she walked off. So very exciting.
All right, Mike, tell me, how do you feel tonight went? What are your thoughts as this place clears out?
I'm excited. She's within striking distance of Trump here, and we're really excited for her moving forward to stay in this race and give him some competition throughout the primary season. I mean, if you look at the polling numbers a few weeks ago, she was down in the teens and the 20s, and now she pulled 40% or more tonight. So we're very excited. We felt a lot of energy throughout the state of especially a lot of the independents and the more moderate Republicans moving towards her. So I think she can carry this forward in a lot of the other states coming up.
Now, she was a long shot to win tonight, but I talked to a lot of supporters who were hopeful coming in that she could make inroads with certain voters, and her appealing to Republicans who were tired of some of the Trump rhetoric and the chaos. Was that something that resonated with you? And when did you kind of decide at what point that this was a candidate you wanted to get behind?
Yeah, we were looking at the pool of candidates back in December, and she actually went to a brewery, a rally at a brewery near us a couple days after Christmas. And we brought the whole family that was visiting us out to it, and we just felt the enthusiasm and the energy coming out of her, and the excitement to get behind a candidate that could be a leader for the new generation and not somebody that's in their late 70s, 80 years old, that's already been in office for the last 4 or 8 years, and bring new ideas and new excitement and new energy to the position.
You mentioned to me that you voted for Trump in 2016.
Yes.
You didn't vote for him in 2020. Do you have any idea, 2024, it's November, and Trump's on the ballot, what do you know what you'll do? Do you have any idea?
I have to see where we're at. I mean, we're 10 months away. There's 91 indictments against Trump right now. We have to see how all those court cases go. Biden is going to be 82 years old this year. You can definitely tell he has some health issues. It's not a great choice, I think, either way. But we'll just have to see where we're at come November this year, if that's the case. But we're still hopeful that Nikki can stay in and she can build off of this performance tonight and then start picking off some states, particularly when we get to Super Tuesday.
One thing that you mentioned to me that was interesting is that you talked about how few candidates there were. That you're in past primaries, you used to, a dozen candidates, 10 candidates. How different has it felt here in the state with really just, with DeSantis dropping out a few days ago, with really just 2 candidates to choose from?
Yeah, I think it's really a sad situation for the voters that we don't have much of a choice. I mean, as you said a few months ago, we had Doug Burgum, we had Tim Scott, we had DeSantis all going around the state. And the fact that they all dropped out, prior to this primary is really unprecedented, for an open primary on our side without an incumbent running. And I think a lot of it is just, Trump, since he had served previously, he's got a big base. He's difficult to run against, but I appreciate Nikki staying in this thing and giving us a choice, and I really hope that she stays forward all the way out to the convention and gives people in the other states a choice going forward. We can't just have a coronation on both sides over the next few months. We need to, battle test these candidates going forward for the general election.
My last question is, she obviously has messages that have resonated with voters like yourself, but she still needs to capture some of the voters that support Trump. What can she do, in your opinion, or what else can she hit on moving into South Carolina and moving on to other states to capture some of those voters, maybe that aren't, full Trump supporters, but kind of still on the fence, but still are voting for Trump, voted for Trump here in Iowa? What can she say to kind of get those voters over to her side?
Yeah, I think she's really just got to appeal to those people that Trump's really more of a candidate of the past. He's going to be 78 years old this year. He's served previously, and a lot of the issues we talk about with immigration, inflation, issues with the economy, what's going on overseas in Ukraine or whatnot. He was there between 2016 and 2020. And then on top of that, like all the chaos, the court cases that we're dealing with. And then, the bottom line is, too, if you're a Republican, you want to beat Biden in November. And most of us feel really strongly, given his baggage that he has, he's not going to be able to pull that off and appeal to the more moderate, independent voters of the country.
Well, Mike, thanks a lot for joining us. Thanks. Libby, back to you in D.C.
Thanks so much, Jorge. Really appreciate it. Rhonda, let's talk about just how the candidates have been trying to make their pitch to voters in New Hampshire. It's so interesting to hear Jorge ask that Haley supporter, what can she do to reach the Trump supporters? So tell us about how Nikki Haley's team has been trying to appeal to people in New Hampshire through ads and mailers and all that other stuff.
Well, first, just as the voter that Jorge just spoke to said, it's that message of she's not bringing all the chaos that Donald Trump would bring. But there are two very specific issues that I've noticed the Trump campaign tried to hit her on. One of them is Social Security. There's this ad running that says she will take away your Social Security. What it doesn't say is that Haley said she wants to raise the age for it for folks who aren't currently receiving Social Security. She wants to raise the age for people who will be expected to take that benefit on in decades from now. But that alone probably is a compelling argument for many older voters here in New Hampshire. I know if you look at the census data, New Hampshire is one of the states in the north that is aging. It does have a lot of people in its population that are over 65. So the ad against Haley on that issue could have been compelling tonight. The other policy issue that I'm seeing raised on the Trump side against her is immigration. That was another ad that keeps running in high rotation, and it says she's not strong enough against the border issues, and she won't call people coming over the border illegals. That's what the ad says. And that is language that she has not used, and says she doesn't just merely call them illegals. So those are two issues, immigration and Social Security, that I think were very specific to this race that I have seen play out in ads. But of course, on the Haley side, it has really been a chorus of her supporters, like we just heard from, people on her campaign trying to tell New Hampshire voters and tell the country that she's the one with less baggage, and also she's the younger candidate who could beat Biden.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. While you're watching live coverage of the New Hampshire primary from the Washington Post, two quick calls tonight in the Republican and Democratic primaries, one for Trump and one for Biden. Any minute now, we're expecting former President Trump to address his supporters in Nashua, New Hampshire. Stay with us.
The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.
We have a country in disarray and a world on fire, and we need to know that we are not giving our kids options of two 80-year-olds going into a presidency.
Nikki Haley is counting on Democrats and liberals to infiltrate your Republican primary.
The reality is, who lost the House for us? Who lost the Senate? Who lost the White House? Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Donald Trump.
In 2016, I declared, I am your voice. Today, I add, I am your warrior, I am your justice, I am your retribution.
This is live coverage of the New Hampshire primary from the Washington Post. I'm Libby Casey. Well, so far tonight, the Associated Press has called the Republican primary in New Hampshire for former President Donald Trump. In the Democratic primary, a write-in campaign for Joe Biden has been successful. The Associated Press calling that race for the sitting president, though no delegates at stake in the Democratic primary tonight. Let's go to Rhonda Colvin for the big takeaways so far this evening. Rhonda?
Well, the big takeaway is that Trump, right after Iowa, appears to be in good shape here in New Hampshire. Independents were supposed to be sort of the engine of Nikki Haley tonight. We aren't quite seeing that, although there are pockets, as James has shown us, where she is performing well or better than others. So there is that component of this. And of course, the other takeaway is that write-in campaign that Democrats across the state of New Hampshire launched was successful, where President Biden appears to have won that Democratic primary, which typically would not have been a question. But because New Hampshire decided to defy the DNC's ruling that they wanted South Carolina to go first, that was an open question earlier today. But those are the things that we do know right now. We are still, waiting to hear from the former president. How is he going to project this win? He was incredibly confident the last time we saw him on the stage in Iowa. He also had people people who are flanking him that might be on Team Trump moving forward, maybe part of his administration or VP list. So we'll have to see what the former president is going to project tonight. But this is something that the Secretary of State did tell me yesterday, is they thought the results would come in a timely fashion, that this would not really be prolonged. And part of the reason was because there was so much energy behind the former president, and people wanted to get in on this contest tonight.
All right, thanks so much, Rhonda. And you can see the stage set there for Donald Trump to speak shortly. The Washington Post has a team behind the scenes tracking the latest results and analyzing them as they come in. So joining us now is their principal data scientist, Lenny Bronner. Lenny, good evening. I know you're looking closely at who is voting for the candidates, especially Trump, and how it compares to how those people voted last time there was a big Republican primary fight. What are you learning?
That's exactly right, Libby. So what we do is we take results from the 2016 in this case, Iowa caucus, because these are the results that we already have, the caucus that happened last week. We took the 2016 results on a precinct level, that's the most granular level that we have, and compared them to the results that from the last week's election, 2024, also on the precinct level. And then we add in some demographic data, and we use a statistical model in order to try and estimate where voters flowed from the last caucus, in this case, to the caucus that happened last week. And what we found is what we can see here on this chart that I brought, which is that Donald Trump, here on this one side, this is his 2016 support. Really, he kept most of his voters. He kept more than 90% of his voters compared to 2016. And the other thing that he did really, really well amongst are the Ted Cruz voters. He got more than 2/3 of the Ted Cruz voters. In fact, it's very easy to see that if you add together how Ted Cruz did and how together Donald Trump did in specific precincts, that's pretty much how Donald Trump did in 2024. That's really what we saw in Iowa, and we'll be looking to see whether we see a similar trend tonight in New Hampshire, Libby.
Let's talk about Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis. What kind of vote did they pull in?
Yeah, so Nikki Haley, at least in Iowa, what we saw is did particularly well amongst Marco Rubio voters. She got approximately 1/3 of Marco Rubio voters. Her big problem, so to speak, in Iowa was that a lot of Marco Rubio voters stayed at home. And Ron DeSantis, his problem in Iowa was really that he sort of fell between all the chairs. He got a few voters from Ted Cruz, he got a few voters from Marco Rubio, but he wasn't really able to speak either to the moderate or to the more conservative part of the Republican Party, at least in Iowa, and that's one of the reasons he didn't do as well as he had hoped.
So how do you take that information that we got from Iowa, so helpful in letting us see where voters fall, how do you take that and apply it to New Hampshire, Lenny?
Yeah, so we're actually running a very, very similar model in New Hampshire. We don't have enough data yet in New Hampshire. We really want to make sure that we have as many places reporting as possible so that we have the best possible picture. Now at approximately, there's been 50 or so towns that have finished reporting in New Hampshire. We would really like to wait until that number is more above 200 out of the 238 or so places that we're going to get results from in New Hampshire. But what we're really looking at in this state tonight is whether Nikki Haley was able to keep together the coalition of moderate voters that broke apart in 2016 between Kasich, between Jeb Bush, between Marco Rubio, between Chris Christie. The path that she would have had tonight is keeping all those voters together. It's clear at this point that she wasn't able to keep it together, but we're trying to differentiate which of those voters she had the biggest problem speaking to. Was it the Jeb Bush voters? Was it the Kasich voters? Who are the voters of the moderate part of the Republican Party in New Hampshire that she wasn't able to bring into the fold?
So fascinating. Lenny Bronner, principal data scientist, thank you so much. JM, as we watch that stage for Donald Trump to come out, I want to reflect on this question of these moderate voters, because Lenny just told us that half of New Hampshire's voters in 2016 could basically be called moderates. But Nikki Haley's falling short of that number so far. We know Trump is projected to win tonight. Where has she been able to make inroads? Where has she struggled?
The key to Haley tonight, she had to outperform with undeclareds in New Hampshire, right? And not only did she have to outperform with that, she had to pick up more share of Republican voters, self-identified Republicans, self-identified conservatives, than what was showing up in the polls. That has been kind of the issue for her tonight. Still some vote to come in, so still some opportunities here, but Lenny did a great job there sort of outlining, where the dynamics are, what we're still looking for here. But that coalition is going to be key as we go forward here, because the makeup of these states, not to put the cart too far in front of the horse here, but as we look ahead to kind of what's next on the calendar, a lot of these states don't look like New Hampshire. So what part of that coalition can she kind of grow in these states that on paper right now in the initial polling is not in her corner. She's not doing at this point what she needs to do. We'll see if she can change some of the dynamics there.
Yeah, that's where this idea of voter flow, where voters go in a year like 2016, the last time there was this competitive Republican primary, to this year is so fascinating because we do see how they migrate, but also maybe how their desires have changed, how their goals have changed. It's so revealing about the Republican electorate in many ways.
Absolutely. Well, and think about the Obama to Trump to Biden to maybe Trump or Haley voter, right, this time around. There's always different motivating factors for voters. There's always different reasons why, they might switch their vote from one candidate to another. But the one way that Trump has really sort of thrown out the old political playbook here in some ways is Trump is not doing, to the same extent that we've seen before, the traditional retail politicking, if you will, in an Iowa, in a New Hampshire that we've seen before.
Okay, political watchers, here's the question. Is that George Santos that you see on your screen there at the Trump rally? He just turned around to face this stage. Feel free to send us a message on your various social media platforms to confirm or rebut. Let's go live to Nashua in just a moment. You're seeing that screen right there. Trump will be speaking soon. We'll keep that screen on while we go to Rhonda Colvin. Rhonda, you are not too far away in Manchester, so we'll keep doing this split screen moment here. What have you been hearing from voters as you've traveled around New Hampshire the last few days? What have you been hearing from voters and some of the leaders of the party as they've had to weigh this question of whether to vote for Haley or Trump?
There were two voters who stood out to me. I went to two polling sites this afternoon. I asked one woman if she had voted, because here you can't talk to a voter as they're going in. You need to talk to them as they're going out. And I asked her, did she vote? She said, yes, she always votes. She had enthusiasm about being first in the nation. And when I asked her, would she mind sharing who she supported, she said she did not want to share who that person was. And then she walked away, and then she came back and she said, but I wish I could have voted for a little bit of everyone. She really seemed to have been struggling with which decision to make now that this contest was down to two. The other person that stood out to me was an older gentleman who said he was a lifelong Manchester resident. And when I asked him who he supported, even before I finished the sentence, he said Nikki. He used her first name as if he was on a first name basis with her. And he said she's honest and she's not like the other guy. And he kind of smiled at me, and I assumed the other guy was Trump. But you saw that he wanted somebody who doesn't have the chaos. So that was a person where that messaging worked with him.
Donald Trump greeting his supporters there in Nashua. You can see there other candidates who've dropped out along the way. Vivek Ramaswamy, also Tim Scott.
From the lakes of Minnesota to the hills of Tennessee, across the plains of Texas, from sea to shining sea, from Detroit down to Houston, and New York to LA, where there's pride in every American heart, and it's time we stand and say that I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free.
Trump there on stage, and some of the people on stage with him are some formal rivals. Vivek Ramaswamy, Tim Scott, JM. He's getting these endorsements from some of them, some of whom, frankly, may hope to be his VP.
Yes, absolutely. We've already heard speculation of that this week. Tim Scott's name has been thrown around, especially. And this is sort of the coalescing around Trump. We saw some endorsements come out even tonight.
So family members there, people we know who've worked on his campaign, people who even served in the campaigns and the White House. This is an important moment for the Trump campaign because he has been able, as James pointed out, to nail both these states, Iowa and New Hampshire, which does give him significant momentum going forward, JM.
Exactly. No Republican president in modern era has ever won the nomination. If they've won both Iowa and New Hampshire, they've always gone on to win the nomination. And frankly, it's going to be interesting here to see how he responds to those really direct attacks from Nikki Haley.
Right. Trump, let's go to him now live as he addresses his supporters in Nashua.
Well, I want to thank everybody. This is a fantastic state. This is a great, great state. You know, we won New Hampshire 3 times now, three. We win it every time. We win the primary, we win the generals, we've won it, and it's a very, very special place to me. It's very important. If you remember in 2016, we came here and we needed that win, and we won by 21 points, and it was great. And today, I have to tell you, it was very interesting because I said, wow, what a great victory. But then somebody ran up to the stage all dressed up nicely when it was at 7. But now I just walked up and it's at 14. But she ran up when it was 7. And, you know, we have to do what's good for our party. And she was up and I said, wow, she's doing like a speech like she won. She didn't win, she lost. And you know, last week we had a little bit of a problem, and if you remember, Ron was very upset because she ran up and she pretended she won Iowa. And I looked around, I said, didn't she come in 3rd? Yeah, she came in 3rd. And then I looked at the polls, she was talking about most winnability, who's going to win, and I had one put up. I don't know if you see it, but I have one put up. We've won almost every single poll in the last 3 months against crooked Joe Biden, almost every poll. And she doesn't win those polls. And she doesn't win those. This is not your typical victory speech, but let's not have somebody take a victory when she had a very bad night. She had a very bad night. And you have the now very unpopular governor of this state. This guy, he's got to be on something. I've never seen anybody with energy. He's like hopscotch. And, you know, I'm watching this guy, and 2 weeks ago he said, we're going to win in the landslide, we're going to win. About 3 days ago he started saying, well, we want to do well. That's a big difference. But I walked out just now, we're 14 points up, and I don't know what it's going to be. But when she was up here, it was like 6 or 7. And, you know, with like 7% of the vote counted. Now, let me just tell you, we had an unbelievable week last week in Iowa. We set a record. It was the best in the history of the caucus, in the history. And I remember I sort of had the same feeling. I'm up and I'm watching, and I said, she's taking a victory lap. And we beat her so badly, she was... But Ron beat her also. You know, Ron came in 2nd and he left. She came in 3rd and she's still hanging around. The other thing, she only got 25% of the Republican votes. I don't know if you saw that. Tremendous numbers of independents came out because in this state, because you have a governor that doesn't frankly know what the hell he's doing, in this state, in the Republican primary, they accept Democrats to vote. In fact, I think they had 4,000 Democrats before October 6th. They already voted. Now, they're only voting because they want to make me look as bad as possible. Because if you remember, we won in 2016. And if you really remember, and if you want to play it straight, we also won in 2020. By more. And we did much better in 2020 than we did in 2016. But as they said, we lost by a whisker, just by a whisker. No. But we can't let that happen. You know, you have to have people that speak up. I said, I can go up and I can say to everybody, oh, thank you for the victory. It's wonderful. Or I can go up and say, who the hell was the imposter that went up on the stage before and like claimed a victory? She did very poorly, actually. She had to win. The governor said, she's going to win, she's going to win, she's going to win. Then she failed badly. Now, I have here, if he promises to do it in a minute or less, but the only person more angry than, let's say me, but I don't get too angry, I get even. The only person, because he was there, and he did fantastically well, by the way, and then he endorsed me. And we don't have to talk about Tim Scott, who, by the way, just got engaged, we have to tell you. And that's more important than all of this stuff. But a man that got to know her very well is Vivek. I said, Vivek. I said, Vivek, go up and say a few words about it. He has to do it in 1 minute or less, and then we're going to just say, we had one hell of a night tonight. And one other thing, before Vivek comes, do you see that poll? We're going to put it up. We have beaten Biden. You could almost say, who can't? Who the hell can't? The man can't put two sentences together. He can't find the stairs off a stage. Who can't? But Vivek, 1 minute or less. Go do it, Vivek.
What we saw tonight is America first defeating America last. That's what we saw tonight. If you want America last, you can go to Joe Biden. You got another.
Okay, Vivek Ramaswamy, assigned by Donald Trump to take hits at Nikki Haley. That's what seems to be happening right now. James Hohmann, I want to just talk a little bit about what we heard from Donald Trump right there. When he was declaring his victory in Iowa, he really stayed on prompter, James. He stuck to the script. Then he went off script and started lying and telling falsehoods about a variety of things, including what happened during his administration, what's happened during Biden's administration. Tonight, he seemed to not be able to resist, James, going over his beefs list, right?
Yeah.
And calling out Nikki Haley. She did seem to successfully get under his skin.
Yes.
In her speech tonight. People in the crowd were yelling out bird brain, and he couldn't help but attack the governor of New Hampshire, one of, frankly, the few Republicans who hasn't endorsed him and has instead endorsed Nikki Haley. I wanted you to do some fact-checking for us about the numbers by which Donald Trump is leading. What do we know so far at this point in the night?
Yeah, with 41% of the vote in, Donald Trump is only up 7 points. Now, 7 points, a win is a win. He's over 50%, but he is not up double digits as he was claiming. He's only up 7%. It was striking. He opened by claiming that he won New Hampshire in the general election. In fact, he lost it in both 2016 and 2020. I mean, the deep irony of that going after Haley was he was complaining that Haley claimed credit for winning when she really lost, which, considering the past 4 years, feels a little rich coming from someone who lost the 2020 election and has convinced a slight majority of even New Hampshire voters in the Republican primary today that he actually won that election when he, in fact, did not.
Thank you, James. Let's go back to Rich, who's outside Donald Trump's event tonight and was listening to that speech. Rich?
You know, kind of interesting letting Vivek speak. I don't know that I've ever seen a campaign victory speech at a watch party where you turn it over to one of your former challengers, even if he's endorsing. So I thought that was an interesting note. He also did go after Nikki Haley, you know, immediately, even calling her an imposter, somewhat making fun of her speech in Iowa after the caucus and her speech here, saying that she sounded like she won, pointing out that she didn't even finish second in Iowa and that she finished second here. And again, we just talked about he stretched the numbers just a bit, something Donald Trump does frequently on stretching the numbers. I will say, though, that he did win, you know, and he did win here. And I'm not sure that it's fair or you know, okay for anyone to say, well, he only won by 7, 8, 9 points. I mean, that's still a significant win, and he's won both of the contests so far. Again, though, there is momentum. There's definitely momentum for Nikki Haley. I do think this will be enough, you know, to galvanize some of her supporters. But you also know that Donald Trump is going to fight back. He's going to also rally his troops and say, listen, we really need to do this in South Carolina. Boy, that's going to be exciting, you know, and it is, of course, not the next contest, but the next major one and the next one that is really open to both Nikki Haley and Donald Trump. Even though she's way behind now, she has about a month to figure that out before going home to her home state of South Carolina. One final note from me, Libby. Doug Burgum, got about 17 votes so far tonight, and I apologize for booting his name earlier.
Not at all, Rich. Your reporting has been stellar, and thank you so much. You've been out in the cold of Iowa and the moderate cold of New Hampshire, so really appreciate all the reporting that you've done. Stay warm. And hey, South Carolina is going to be a lot warmer, Rich. Let's go to Rhonda Colvin, who's also in New Hampshire tonight, to talk a little bit more about what we've heard tonight from Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. Rhonda?
I think what we just heard from the former president is that this is going to get a lot nastier. Now that we are down to 2 Republican candidates heading into the home state of one of those candidates, it did appear like Trump is ready to take this challenge on. He said something that certainly matches what we've been reporting when we report on him, is that he doesn't get angry, he gets even. That's what the former president said tonight. It does seem that because he may have been a little rattled that the undeclared and the independent-minded voters in New Hampshire kind of gave him a little bit of a run for his money, that he is going to go full speed ahead at attacking Haley ongoing. So we'll see what that looks like. We will be there to cover it, of course, the remaining weeks until South Carolina. But one thing I did want to bring up that I said at the top of our show is Donald Trump has been saying that Democrats could vote in this primary, that they would infiltrate and give more votes to Haley. That is not true. The deadline to change your party was back in October. I believe he said back in October, Democrats already voted. I think he said 4,000 of them. That is not true. New Hampshire only has one primary day. They don't have any sort of early voting. And anybody who wanted to vote on the Republican ballot today would have had to change their party if they were a Democrat back in the fall. So just setting that out there as a fact check to some of the things that we did hear from the former president. But I think overall, from what we heard from her earlier, that she seems like she's in it for the remaining few weeks at least, and that he is going to definitely be in it as well. I think we are in certainly for more contention between those ranks of the Republican Party, those ideologies, the anti-Trump and the Trump base. So we'll be there to cover it.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. Let's go back to Jorge, who's in Concord. Jorge, what does Haley do with tonight in New Hampshire? We are still waiting to see the final spread and the results. But how does her campaign take this and go forward?
Yeah, you know, Libby, I mean, this was not a concession speech, and it wasn't, contrary to what Donald Trump said, a victory speech. It was a let's keep going speech, right? I mean, she congratulated Donald Trump at the beginning of the speech, but then really talked about the issues that she's hit at consistently throughout her campaign, about being the alternative to Donald Trump and the one that could beat Biden easily. So this was definitely like a let's look ahead to South Carolina. And what's interesting is talking to voters here at the end of the night, they were disappointed, obviously, but they were happy that she did as well as she had. I mean, she's done pretty good. But pretty good doesn't win elections, and going to South Carolina, as was mentioned at throughout the show, is going to be a tougher road ahead for her with a lot of the voters that she needs to win these races, and there's more of them in South Carolina than there were here in New Hampshire. I talked to a young couple with their daughter that was here earlier, and they were definitely disappointed. And the mother had told me that she voted in 2016 and 2020 for Trump, but that she wanted to vote for someone who was a role model for her daughter, and that she saw that in Nikki Haley. I don't know if that kind of stuff translates throughout the electorate, that she needs to get those voters to win in South Carolina. You know, she had a key endorsement here in the state of New Hampshire with Kristen News. She's missing those largely in South Carolina. I don't know how much that affects people when they come to vote. Again, that was talked about on the show, that maybe that doesn't factor in as much as it used to. But there's no denying that she's going to a state where she's behind. It's her home state. So there's a lot to make up for in this month that she has in between that. But she's definitely, this end of the speech here was not any kind of speech, did not look down. The crowd was roaring. The music was super loud. And the crowd was cheering throughout the speech when she mentioned things about Donald Trump. And so I think that's just going to keep continuing on in this month, and we'll see how she does in the road ahead.
Thanks so much, Jorge Ribas. James, let's go to you. You've been looking at the exit polls that we've been getting out of New Hampshire. What new are you learning at this hour?
Yeah, Libby, more and more data continues to come in, and I've really been looking at the crosstabs for some sort of sense of where the Republican nominating contest goes from here. And the dividing lines are becoming pretty clear based on the first two states. Interestingly, we haven't mentioned this yet, but there is a meaningful gender gap. Among men, Donald Trump won by 18 points. Among women, it's neck and neck, but Nikki Haley edged out Trump among women. Probably not surprising. Men tend to make up more of the Republican electorate now as women have moved toward the Democratic Party in greater numbers during the Trump era. But I want to show you this education graphic because it is really stark. Half of voters didn't graduate from college, just over half. Trump won them 2-1, 66-32. The other half did graduate from college. Haley won them 58-39. Another way of looking at this that correlates somewhat closely is family income. The more money a family makes, the better Haley did. You can see Donald Trump running up the score, winning 7 in 10 voters who make under $50,000 a year, 55% between 50 and 100K, and Nikki Haley winning the majority of voters who make more than $100,000 a year. These dividing lines are especially stark when you consider that Trump won more than 50% of every age group in our exit polling, including he actually did best, smallish sample, but he did best among 18 to 29-year-olds in the Republican primary, winning more than 60%. So he has broad-based appeal by age, but there is this real dividing line on class. The bad news for Nikki Haley as she looks ahead is that a lot of the Republican base does not have college degrees and is in that lower income tier.
Thank you so much, James. JM, tomorrow night, Nikki Haley has an event in Charleston. What will you be listening for from her as she takes this fight to South Carolina?
Does she sharpen her attacks even more on Trump, right? This is the two-person race that she says that she wanted. Can she start to build that momentum, cut into what we've seen in the initial polling in terms of Trump's lead in South Carolina? And we said going into tonight that this was sort of the do or die, and now South Carolina is sort of the do or die at this point, right? So goalposts.
You're moving the goalpost on me, JM.
Goalposts moved, right? But, you know, it's interesting because we talked about Trump, some of his remarks going after Haley a little more. You know, it is so clear that Trump said going into tonight that he wanted Haley to drop out. He said that over the weekend, right? His surrogate said that over the weekend. They wanted to end things tonight. At this point, doesn't look like things are ending. So, but we know that the Trump campaign wants to get this wrapped up as quickly as possible, that being the nomination fight here, the primary process, so that they can pivot to the general election, so that they can coalesce fundraising. And we did see the Biden campaign acknowledge that it seems like Trump is the nominee. I'll read you just the first part of that. They said, quote, this is from the Biden campaign, tonight's results confirm Donald Trump has all but locked up the GOP nomination. So, you know, take that.
Now, of course, they can fundraise off that, right?
They can fundraise off that. This is Trump talking about the general, and Biden is a fundraising play for them. But we did see two more Republican senators come out tonight, John Cornyn of Texas, Deb Fischer of Nebraska, come out and endorse Trump. So the contours of this race to be defined here. A month is a long time in politics. Whether Haley can build that momentum that she needs to build going into South Carolina is going to be the key thing we're watching.
Rhonda, what do those late endorsements from those senators mean to you, someone who covers Congress so closely?
Well, it is something that I've been watching because back in 2016, as well as 2020, we did see some of the national Republicans shift their messaging on Trump. We saw them be very critical in the beginning. Somebody like Lindsey Graham, who's very critical of the former president, all to shift that messaging and be very supportive of him. So to see congressional Republicans in the House, of course, in the Senate, come up and support the former president after January 6th, after the indictments, after all of this, that's really telling when you want to look at the direction the Republican Party wants to go on. Is the train left without a conductor? Are they just going to continue to go behind Donald Trump? Are they going to perhaps try to give Nikki Haley a little bit of a boost? Some of them that haven't yet endorsed. But it is an important factor, I think, when you look at national Republicans and see which way they're going, because essentially that's where the party is going. And this is probably one of the last opportunities if the Republican Party wanted to change back course to be more moderate, less baggage. This would be the contest to do it in, this entire primary contest. And if you're seeing national Republicans support Trump again, that's truly telling. So we'll have to see and look at that endorsement count moving forward as we continue on in the coming weeks. But it really is fascinating times to be reporting on a primary like this, where you have a person who voters feel is the incumbent president, the former President Trump, and you have somebody who worked in his administration, was picked by him, all to battle it out. So, of course, we'll be watching and reporting to our viewers what happens next.
Thanks so much, Rhonda. James, I want to hear more about what you'll be watching overnight as people continue to refresh their Washington Post homepage as they wake up tomorrow morning. I want to hear from you what we should be looking at in terms of numbers. But I also want to put this out there. As Haley gets under Donald Trump's skin and he goes after her, he goes off script, and he's going to reveal himself to voters who will then decide if they like that or they don't like that. And I want to share a piece that our colleague Aaron Blake wrote about how Trump's doing some flubs, some mistakes on the campaign trail, and the more that Nikki Haley points them out, the more everyone pays attention to it. And it may blunt one of the big attacks he has on Joe Biden, which is mental acuity and age, something that you have been looking at in the polls and whether or not voters are concerned about that.
Yeah, and I thought one of the more powerful moments of Haley's concession speech tonight was challenging Donald Trump forcefully to a debate. Now that it is a two-person race, clearly Donald Trump wants to present himself as the presumptive nominee. He's trotting out these endorsements. But if Haley's running hard for more than a month in her native state, where she is a favorite daughter, hammering Trump for refusing to debate her, that undercuts a lot of sort of Trump's appeal. It makes him look scared. It makes it look like he's running from the basement. So will Haley be able to get under Trump's skin enough to maybe force him to have a debate, or will he be able to sort of just will himself past her and not feel like he needs to engage? So right now, 45% of the vote has been counted. Donald Trump has a 7.5-point lead. We're still watching the margin. That does matter a great deal. And it really does seem, drilling deep into the returns, like Haley has essentially recreated the John Kasich coalition. Kasich finished second in 2016 to Trump, and his coalition really included three parts. Nikki Haley is overperforming John Kasich in the state capital of Concord. She is getting more votes, more than he did. Not a huge margin, but a decent. Hanover. This is the home of Dartmouth University. Rob Portman campaigned with Nikki Haley there last week. This is a college town. Remember, the only county that Haley won in Iowa was Johnson County, where the University of Iowa is. Here she's really running away with it. Donald Trump only getting 13% of the vote in the most educated township in the state. And then you can see down here in the seacoast, this is a little sea of yellow. In an area like Portsmouth, Haley beating Trump nearly 2-1 with most of the vote coming in. So this is a coalition that can get you to 45% in New Hampshire. It cannot get you to a majority. Donald Trump really winning the working class areas, the population centers, and staying competitive in the suburbs where he struggles in a general election context. But this is the Haley coalition. So we're watching to see just how tight this stays. But it certainly is a victory for Donald Trump. And the question is, can he use this to wrap up the nomination sooner than later?
Well, this has been live election coverage of the New Hampshire primary from the Washington Post. The big news tonight, of course, that former President Donald Trump has won the New Hampshire Republican primary, beating out Nikki Haley. Haley vowed to fight on, even though she faces an uphill battle in her home state of South Carolina. And a daunting prospect of Super Tuesday is on the horizon when voters in 14 states will head to the polls. The Washington Post will cover it all. I'd like to thank my guests tonight, including our field reporters of Rich Matthews and Jorge Ribas and their crews, and senior political correspondent Rhonda Colvin, live from Manchester. Also my colleagues here in the studio, J.M. Rieger, and our election insights team led by James Homan, and all of our reporters who are live in New Hampshire tonight. I'm Libby Casey. Thank you so much for watching, and good night.
The Washington Post newsroom delivers breaking events around the world as they happen. Unrivaled reporting from the journalists you've come to trust. To get the facts fast and meet the challenges of today head on. Get the news that matters most with a special offer by visiting WashingtonPost.com/watch. Subscribing unlocks instant access, bringing you the Post's award-winning coverage anytime, any place. Because democracy dies in darkness.